Eleanor Whitmore crushed the letter in her fist so hard the paper tore, and the sound of it, that small, pathetic rip, was the loneliest thing she had ever heard in her life. She had traveled 840 miles on that train. 840 miles of soot and hard wooden benches and strangers who didn't look at her twice, holding that letter against her chest like it was the deed to a better life. And now, she was standing on a platform in Harlan Creek, Montana, in the late October cold, watching the last passenger disappear around the corner of the depot building, and there was nobody waiting for her. There had never been anybody waiting for her. If you've ever felt like the world made a promise it never intended to keep, stay with me, because this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The station clerk's name was Mr. Aldous Finch, and he was a small, precise man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and a mustache that seemed to be trying to leave his face. He had watched Eleanor from behind his window for the better part of 20 minutes before he finally came outside, because in his experience, a woman sitting that still on a platform bench with a torn letter in her lap was either waiting for someone who was very late or waiting for someone who was never coming at all. He cleared his throat. Eleanor did not look up. He cleared it again. "Miss," he said, "the next eastbound train doesn't come through until Thursday." Eleanor raised her eyes then, and the clerk saw something in them that made him wish he'd stayed behind his window. Not tears. Something worse than tears. The flat, quiet expression of a woman who has already done her crying on the inside and come out the other side of it into something that looked a lot like nothing at all. "I'm not waiting for a train," she said. "Then what are you waiting for?" She looked back down at the letter. "I'm trying to decide." Aldous Finch was not a cruel man. He was simply a small man in a small town who had learned that other people's problems had a way of becoming your problems if you let them, and he had a wife at home and a supper getting cold and a fire that needed tending. But something about this woman, her stillness, the careful way she held herself, the leather suitcase at her feet that looked like it had been packed by someone who believed this trip was going to matter, made him stay. "You were expected here, miss?" he asked. "I was told I was," Eleanor said, "by a man named Gerald Hatch. He wrote to me in St. Louis. He said he had a farm outside of town and that he needed a wife to help him run it, and that he was a decent man who would treat me right." She paused. "He said he had been praying for someone like me." Aldous Finch was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Hatch," he repeated carefully. "You know him." "I know of him." Eleanor looked up again, and this time her voice was very steady. "Then you know something I don't. And I'd appreciate it if you'd say it plain, Mr. Finch, Aldous Finch." "Mr. Finch?" The clerk took off his spectacles, polished them on his vest, put them back on, and said, "Gerald Hatch got married 3 weeks ago, miss, to a woman named Clara Dobbs. They had the ceremony at the First Methodist Church on a Saturday afternoon, and there was a cake with flowers on it." He hesitated. "I'm sorry, I truly am." Eleanor said nothing. Did he write to you after?" Finch asked. "To tell you not to come?" "He did not." "Maybe the letter got lost in—" "He did not write to me, Mr. Finch." Her voice was still steady, still quiet, the way a river is quiet, right before it goes over the edge of something. "He made a decision, and he decided I did not deserve to know what it was." Aldous Finch put his hands in his pockets and looked at his shoes. Around them, the wind came off the mountains and pushed down the empty platform and rattled the depot sign, and somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and then stopped. "Is there somewhere you can go?" he asked finally. "Family. Anyone you can wire." Eleanor thought of her aunt in Cincinnati who had told her this plan was foolish. She thought of the 2 women she had worked alongside at the laundry in St. Louis who had sewn her a little blue ribbon for her hair as a going-away gift. She thought of the boarding house room she had given up and the small stack of money she had saved over 3 years of work, and how most of it was gone now between the train ticket and the meals and the single night she had spent in a hotel in Billings, because she thought she deserved one good night's sleep before she started her new life. "No," she said. "There's no one." Finch looked at her for a moment longer, and then he said the only honest thing he could say. "I'm sorry, miss. I truly don't know what to tell you." He went back inside. Eleanor sat. The cold came down harder as the afternoon bled into early evening, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and the torn letter on the bench beside her and the leather suitcase at her feet. And she thought about the question she had been turning over since she first read Gerald Hatch's letter 11 weeks ago in the corner room of Mrs. Patton's boarding house in St. Louis. Why would someone like him want someone like me? She had told herself it was because she was capable, because she could cook and clean and manage accounts and work harder than most people half her size. She had told herself that Gerald Hatch had seen something practical and solid in her, something worth choosing, and that was enough. That was more than she'd been given before. She had not let herself think too hard about the word want. Now she sat on the platform in the dark and the cold, and she understood something clearly in the way that only public humiliation can make a thing clear. She had never been wanted. She had been selected, and even that had turned out to be a mistake, or a lie, or something in between that was somehow worse than either one. Eleanor Whitmore was 25 years old. She was what people in St. Louis called big-boned, which was their polite way of saying what they actually meant, and she had spent most of her life learning to read the half-second pause before people spoke to her, that tiny hesitation, while their eyes made a judgment they thought they were hiding. She had learned to dress carefully and speak clearly, and carry herself with a kind of deliberate stillness that said, "I see you looking," and I am not ashamed even on the days she was. She had been passed over for a job at a dress shop because the owner said she would make the other women uncomfortable. She had watched a man at a church social look at her face, then her body, then back at his plate, and that had been the end of that conversation. She had heard a woman on a street corner in Cincinnati say to her companion, loud enough to carry, "Can you imagine, poor thing?" And she had walked another 4 blocks before she stopped and stood very still against a brick wall and made herself breathe. She was not unaccustomed to being overlooked. But she had believed she had allowed herself to believe just this once, that things were going to be different. She pressed her lips together and looked up at the sky, which had gone the dark blue-gray of late evening, and the first stars were beginning to appear cold and distant and indifferent. "Maybe," she said softly to no one, "maybe people like me are never meant to be chosen." And then she heard a voice. "Don't sit alone, miss." It came from her left low, and even the way a man speaks when he's not trying to startle anyone, but is aware he might. Eleanor turned her head. He was standing perhaps 8 feet away, which she understood later was deliberate, far enough not to crowd her, close enough to be heard. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a heavy canvas coat that had seen better years, and a dark hat that he was holding in his hands, rather than wearing on his head. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and the kind of deep-set dark eyes that take a moment to read, because they're too careful to give anything away quickly. He was looking at her directly. Not the way men in towns usually looked at her, that sliding, reassessing glance that started at her face, and then traveled, and then found somewhere else to go. He was looking at her the way you look at a person. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "Don't sit alone out here," the man said. "It's going to be near freezing before long, and this platform doesn't offer much in the way of shelter." He paused. "My name is Thomas Carter. I have a ranch about 4 miles out. There's a spare room with a lock on the door and a stove that works, and supper on the fire, and you're welcome to it tonight if you need a place." Eleanor studied him. She had enough experience with the world to know that offers of help from strangers were not always what they looked like. She had enough experience with her own desperation to know that was precisely when those offers were hardest to resist. "Why?" she said. Thomas Carter tilted his head slightly. "Why what? Why would you offer that to a woman you don't know on a train platform at night?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "Because someone did it for me once," he said. "Long time ago. I was in bad shape and a man I didn't know gave me a meal and a dry place to sleep and asked nothing for it. I've tried to return that favor when I've had the chance." He paused. "That's the whole of it, miss. There's nothing else." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "I would work," she said. I wouldn't take something for nothing. If you let me stay, I'd cook clean whatever needed doing. I'm not a woman who sits idle." Thomas Carter nodded, as though this was a reasonable thing to say, and he had expected nothing less. "That would be fine. My name is Eleanor Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore?" He bent down and lifted her suitcase before she could reach for it, and she noted that he did it without asking the way a person does when they're used to carrying things. "My wagon's out front." Eleanor stood. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the hours of sitting, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than the body. The kind of tired that settles in behind your eyes and in your chest when you have been holding something very heavy for a very long time and haven't let yourself put it down yet. She picked up the torn letter from the bench beside her, looked at it for one moment, and then dropped it back down. She did not take it with her. Thomas Carter did not comment on this. They walked off the platform together, this tall, weathered rancher, and this woman who had arrived expecting a future and found an empty platform instead. And behind them, the depot sign rattled once more in the wind, and then the town of Harlan Creek went quiet around them. The wagon was a working wagon, not meant for comfort, with a plank seat and a horse that stood with the patient stillness of an animal who has learned that waiting is simply part of the job. Thomas handed Eleanor up without ceremony and went around to the other side, and when he clicked his tongue and the horse started forward, neither of them spoke for a while. The road out of town was rutted and dark, and the mountains on either side were nothing but shapes against the sky. Eleanor gripped the side of the wagon seat and looked straight ahead, and tried to organize her thoughts, which was something she was usually very good at, and tonight was finding nearly impossible. She had come here with a plan. The plan was gone. She had $8.40 left in her purse. She had a change of clothes and a Bible and a small tin box with her mother's brooch in it, and a receipt book she used for keeping track of household accounts because she couldn't afford not to track things carefully. She had skills that nobody in St. Louis had ever found particularly remarkable, and a mind for numbers that her school teacher had once called wasted on a girl. She had, as far as she could determine, nothing else. "You don't have to tell me," Thomas said, without looking at her. "Tell you what?" "Whatever it is that had you sitting on that platform alone in the dark. You don't have to explain yourself to me." Eleanor glanced at him. His eyes were on the road, his hands easy on the reins. His expression, the same steady, unreadable thing it had been since the moment he spoke to her. "I came out here to marry a man who didn't want me after all," she said. "I thought it was simpler to tell you than to have you wonder." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Hatch," he said. Eleanor turned to look at him more sharply. "You know him too." "Small Valley," Thomas said. "Everybody knows everybody eventually." He paused. "I'm sorry that happened to you, Miss Whitmore." "You're the second person to say so tonight." "Does it help any the second time?" No. Thomas agreed. "It doesn't." They drove on. The Carter Ranch appeared out of the darkness gradually. First the smell of it, hay and horse and wood smoke, and then the shapes of the barn and the outbuildings, and finally the house, which was larger than Eleanor had expected, and darker, most of its windows unlit. There was a lamp burning in what turned out to be the kitchen, and when Thomas pushed open the back door and stepped aside to let her through, Eleanor felt the warmth of the room come out to meet her, like something that had been waiting. The kitchen was practical and clean, in the way that a place is clean when someone keeps it clean out of habit, rather than pride. There was a pot on the stove that smelled of beans and salted pork, and a table with 2 chairs, and a shelf of mismatched crockery, and a window above the sink that was black with night outside it. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room and looked around, and something loosened in her chest just slightly. Just enough. "I'll show you the room," Thomas said. The spare room was small, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window and a hook on the back of the door for clothes, and there was indeed a lock, a solid iron bolt that slid into its bracket with a satisfying clunk when Thomas demonstrated it. "Towel on the washstand," he said. "Water in the pitcher's cold, but there's hot on the stove. Supper when you're ready." He left her there. Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed and put her hands in her lap and looked at the locked door and breathed. This was not what she had planned. None of this was what she had planned. But she was warm, and she was safe, and the door was locked. And somewhere on the other side of it, there was a man who had looked at her like she was a person rather than a problem to be solved. And she was, despite everything, despite the 840 miles, and the torn letter, and the empty platform, and Gerald Hatch, and his wedding cake with flowers on it, she was going to be all right. She was going to make sure of it. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who let herself be broken by things she hadn't chosen. She was a woman who had spent 25 years being judged by people who didn't know her, and surviving it. And she understood, sitting on that narrow bed in Thomas Carter's spare room, that surviving was still something. Surviving was, in fact, the whole foundation. You could only build something on what you had left standing. She got up, splashed cold water on her face, straightened her dress, and went out to have supper. Thomas was already at the table when she came in. He had ladled 2 bowls of beans and cut 2 thick slices of bread from a loaf on the counter, and there was a jar of butter and 2 tin cups of something dark that turned out to be coffee that had been on the stove too long and was not good but was hot. They ate without much talking at first. Eleanor noticed things. She noticed that the kitchen was clean, but the pantry shelf she could see through the open door was sparse and disorganized with tins stacked in front of what looked like a ledger book that had no business being in a pantry. She noticed that the woodpile beside the stove was lower than it should be for late October. She noticed that the lamp on the table had a crack in its chimney glass and that the wick needed trimming and was burning unevenly. She noticed these things the way she had always noticed things, automatically, involuntarily, the way some people can't help counting stairs when they walk up a flight of them. "How big is your operation?" she asked. Thomas looked up from his bowl. "Beg your pardon." "Your ranch. How many head of cattle? How many horses?" He studied her for a moment. "About 400 head, a dozen horses." "Why, do you have a foreman?" "I have a hand named Pete, who's been with me 12 years and knows the cattle better than I do, and 2 seasonal men who come in spring and leave before winter." "And the accounts, do you manage those yourself?" Thomas set down his spoon. "Miss Whitmore." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said. "I ask too many questions. My mother used to tell me so." "It's not the questions that surprise me," Thomas said slowly. "It's the questions you're asking." "I notice things," Eleanor said. "I always have. It's not something I do on purpose. It's just the way I see." She paused. "The wick on that lamp needs trimming. And there's a ledger book in your pantry that belongs in a desk." Thomas turned and looked at the pantry, and then looked back at her, and for the first time that evening, something moved in his expression. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "There is a ledger book in my pantry," he said. "That concerns me slightly." "It concerns me too," he said. "I put it there about 6 months ago when the desk in the study got covered in papers I didn't know what to do with, and I haven't found a good moment to deal with any of it since." "Can you tell me," Eleanor said carefully, "approximately how your accounts are sitting?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Not well," was what he said finally. "How not well?" He pushed his bowl aside and folded his hands on the table. He had working hands, she noticed, scarred at the knuckles, calloused in the way that comes from ropes and leather and cold. And he looked at them now like they were something he was considering. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "In a winter storm. She was the one who kept the accounts. She was the one who kept most things, if I'm being honest about it. After she died, I kept the cattle going because that's what I know how to do, and everything else kind of..." He paused. "Everything else kind of piled up." Eleanor said nothing. She understood in the way you understand something, when you recognize the shape of a person's grief even if you've never carried the same kind yourself. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife." Thomas nodded once. "Her name was Margaret. The baby died too. A boy." He said it flat and simple, the way people say things they have said so many times they've worn the jagged edges smooth. "It was a long time ago." 4 years isn't always a long time. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and she held his gaze and didn't look away. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." After supper, Eleanor washed the bowls without being asked, and Thomas dried them without being asked, and they worked side by side at the sink, in a silence that was unexpectedly not uncomfortable. When the last bowl was on the shelf, Thomas trimmed the wick on the lamp without Eleanor saying anything more about it, and the light in the kitchen steadied and brightened. "I'll get the ledger book," he said. "Not tonight," Eleanor said. "It's late. Tomorrow's soon enough." He looked at her with that same careful expression. "You're planning to be here tomorrow." "If the offer stands." "The offer stands, Miss Whitmore." "Then tomorrow we'll look at your accounts," she said. "And we'll figure out where things stand." She went to bed in the small room with the locked door and lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards as Thomas moved about the settling of the wood stove, the wind outside that had grown teeth since she'd arrived and was now pressing against the windows with intent. She had come here to marry a man and build a life. The man had turned out to be a lie. But here she was, in a warm room in the dark, with a plan already forming behind her eyes, the way plans always did when she let her mind work in the quiet. And she thought carefully, without letting herself hope too much, that maybe there was still a life to be built here. A different one than she'd imagined. Perhaps a better one. She closed her eyes and slept. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had retrieved the ledger book from the pantry, found 3 more in the study, under a pile of correspondence that dated back 2 years, spread everything across the kitchen table after supper 3 nights in a row, and constructed from the organized wreckage of Thomas Carter's finances a picture that was worrying but not yet hopeless. "You're losing money on the South Pasture," she told him on the 3rd night, pointing to a column she'd rewritten in her own careful hand. "You're paying to maintain it, and running about 60 head on it, but the yield doesn't justify the cost of the maintenance. Either it needs more cattle, or it needs less investment." Thomas leaned over the table to look where she was pointing. He was close enough that she could smell wood smoke on his coat, and she moved very slightly to the left, because proximity to men was not something she navigated easily, particularly men she wasn't sure about yet. "Pete's been saying the same thing for a year," Thomas said. "I just didn't have the numbers in front of me. Now you do." Eleanor straightened. "There's also a feed supplier you're paying more than you should be. There are 2 suppliers in Billings who are cheaper by a significant enough margin that it would matter over a year. I can write the letters if you want. I have good commercial correspondence." Thomas looked at her. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes? Why would a woman who can do all this?" He gestured at the spread of papers and ledgers. "Why would a woman who can manage accounts and write commercial correspondence and find the problem in a ranch operation in 3 days?" He stopped. Why was she answering a letter from Gerald Hatch? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She picked up her pencil and turned it in her fingers. "Because nobody in St. Louis was looking for someone who could manage accounts," she said finally. "They were looking for something else, and I didn't fit what they were looking for, and I was tired." She paused. "I was very tired of being overlooked. And Gerald Hatch's letter said he needed someone capable. That was the word he used. Capable." She set the pencil down. "I believed him." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "He's a fool," he said. "He's a man who found something he wanted more," Eleanor said. "I can't entirely blame him for that." "He left you on a platform in the cold without sending word," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that had gone flat and serious. "I can blame him for that." Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the ledger, not at her, but his jaw was set in a way that told her the flatness in his voice was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, still looking at the ledger. "Let's figure out the feed suppliers." Within 3 weeks, Eleanor had reorganized the pantry, the study, and the account books. She had written letters to 2 suppliers in Billings, and received favorable quotes back, had drawn up a comparison that showed Thomas the projected savings, and had suggested a rotation for the South Pasture that she'd read about in an agricultural pamphlet at the post office, while she was mailing one of the letters. She had also quietly, and without making a production of it, fixed the crack in the lamp chimney with a method she'd learned from the woman in the boarding house in St. Louis, repaired a loose hinge on the kitchen cupboard, identified the source of a draft coming under the back door, and stuffed it with a folded piece of canvas, and spent 2 afternoons reorganizing the root cellar with a system that made it possible to see what you had without moving everything else out of the way to look. Thomas noticed all of it. He did not say much, but she caught him sometimes standing in the pantry doorway, looking at the organized shelves, or at the desk in the study, now cleared and functional, or at the back door where the draft had been. And his expression in those moments was something she couldn't quite name. It was not surprise exactly. It was something quieter than surprise. Pete the ranch hand, who'd worked for Thomas for 12 years, was a wiry, sun-weathered man of about 50, who did not trust easily and showed it plainly. He had greeted Eleanor's first appearance in the yard with an expression of careful neutrality and had said almost nothing to her for the first 2 weeks beyond morning and evening, and the occasional grunt that could have meant anything. Then she'd brought lunch out to the barn one afternoon because it was raining hard, and she thought it seemed unreasonable to make a man walk through that much water for a meal, and she'd set it down on the workbench and turned to go, and Pete said, "You know anything about horses?" She turned back. "Some." "Come look at this one's near foreleg. There's something I want a second eye on." She looked. She was not an expert, but she had grown up on the edges of livestock country, and she knew what she was seeing was a minor soft tissue swelling that wanted rest and cold compresses, not anything worse, and she said so. Pete looked at her sideways. "That's what I thought." "Then why did you want a second eye?" "Because I've been wrong before." He picked up his sandwich. "And it costs less to be wrong out loud than to be wrong on your own." Eleanor nodded. "That's a sensible way to think." Pete ate his sandwich. Eleanor stood in the dry barn listening to the rain. "He's a good man," Pete said without looking at her. "Thomas. A good man who had a bad few years and let some things go that didn't need to go." He paused. "It's good to see things getting back." Eleanor understood that this was the closest Pete was going to come to a welcome, and she accepted it accordingly. "I'll try to be useful," she said. "You already are," Pete said. "That south pasture rotation you suggested, I've been trying to get him to do that for 14 months. He finished the sandwich and wiped his hand on his knee. "He listens different when it comes with numbers attached." In town, the talk had started by the second week. Eleanor learned this from Margaret Sully, who ran the dry goods store and was the kind of woman who delivered information with the air of doing you a very great service. She had come into the store to purchase thread and a small quantity of salt, and had found herself the subject of a warmly delivered interrogation. "You're the woman out at the Carter place," Margaret Sully said. "I am." "People are wondering about the arrangement." "The arrangement?" Eleanor repeated carefully. "Thomas Carter is a respected man in this valley." Margaret Sully leaned on the counter. "A widower of some means well thought of. People are naturally curious when a woman they don't know turns up at his ranch and stays." "I work for room and board," Eleanor said. "I manage the household and the accounts. It's a practical arrangement." "I'm sure it is," Margaret Sully said, in a tone that indicated she found this explanation insufficient. Eleanor bought her thread and her salt and said good morning and left. On the street outside, she passed 2 women she didn't know who looked at her and then at each other and then back at her with expressions she recognized well. She kept walking. There was a man sitting on a barrel in front of the hardware store who said to no one in particular, but loud enough for her to hear, "That's Thomas's charity case then." Eleanor stopped. She turned around. The man on the barrel was somewhere around 40, red-faced, with a vest that strained its buttons, and he was looking at her with the flat amusement of someone who expects no consequences. "I beg your pardon," Eleanor said. The man looked at her and widened his eyes in mock surprise. "Didn't mean anything by it, miss. Just saying what people are saying." "And what are people saying?" He shrugged. "That Carter always was soft-hearted, taking in strays. Eleanor took one step toward him, just one, and something in her face made the man shift slightly on his barrel. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said very clearly and without particular heat. "I am managing Thomas Carter's household accounts and have in 3 weeks identified savings that will amount to a significant sum by year's end. I am not a stray, sir, and I am not a charity case. I am a professional woman doing professional work, and what people choose to say about it tells me rather more about them than it does about me." She paused. "I hope you have a pleasant afternoon." She walked away. Her heart was hammering. But her back was straight, and her steps were even, and she did not look back, and she heard nothing behind her, and she counted that as sufficient. She did not tell Thomas about the man on the barrel. But that same evening, coming into the kitchen from the yard, she heard Thomas speaking in the hallway, speaking to someone she couldn't see, his voice quiet and very level. "I'll say this once," Thomas said, "and then it won't need saying again. Miss Whitmore is under my roof and under my protection, and the next man who has something disrespectful to say about her can come say it to me directly, and we'll see how that conversation goes." Eleanor stood in the kitchen and did not move. She heard a door close. She was at the stove when Thomas came in. "Supper's almost ready," she said. "Smells good," he said. Neither of them mentioned the hallway conversation, but something had shifted. Something small and significant, like a compass needle finding north. Eleanor had been in Harlan Creek for a month when she went to the post office and found a letter waiting for her. The name on the outside was in a hand she didn't recognize, but the letter inside was written on the kind of thick, expensive paper that meant it had come from someone accustomed to spending money on small things as a demonstration of power. She read it twice, standing at the post office counter, and then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. That evening, when the supper dishes were done and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, she set the letter on the table between herself and Thomas. He looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" "A letter," Eleanor said. "From a man named William Hayes." Thomas went very still. "You know that name?" Eleanor said. "I know that name." "He wants me to leave," Eleanor said. "He says it would be better for everyone. He says he has certain information about my reasons for coming here that could prove embarrassing to Mr. Carter if it became public, and that a woman of my particular—" She paused. "He uses the phrase, particular circumstances. He says a woman of my particular circumstances would be wise to accept the money he's offering and go back to wherever she came from." Thomas picked up the letter and read it. His face while he read was a still thing. The kind of still that is not calm, but is the thing that sits underneath calm like bedrock. "How much is he offering?" he asked. $50. Thomas put the letter down. "He wants me to pay you to leave," he said. "Yes." "That means he's worried about something." "Yes," Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. "What do you know about William Hayes?" "Only what I've heard in town in the past 4 weeks," Eleanor said. "He's a businessman. He buys land. He has a great deal of influence in this valley." She paused. "And I've heard his name before, from someone in St. Louis. A woman I knew who had a brother in Montana who lost his property to a man of that name through circumstances that were never quite explained." Thomas was quiet. "Thomas," Eleanor said carefully, "I need you to tell me something honestly. Ask it. Is there a reason a man like William Hayes would want a woman like me gone from your ranch?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "There might be," he said. "Yes." "Then you'd better tell me," Eleanor said. "Because whatever he's worried about, I'd like to understand it. And if there's something I can do to help, I'd like to know that too." She met his eyes. "Because he has already used my life once without my knowledge or permission, and I find I'm not inclined to let that stand." The lamp on the table burned steady between them. Thomas Carter picked up the letter again, and this time when he set it down, he pushed it toward the center of the table, equidistant between them, and that was as clear a thing as Eleanor Whitmore had ever seen. "All right," he said. "Here's what I know." And outside the wind came down from the mountains, and the night settled over Harlan Creek, and in the warm kitchen of the Carter Ranch, Two people who had both been left alone in the dark for reasons they hadn't chosen, sat across a table from each other and began carefully and seriously the work of figuring out what they were going to do about it. Thomas Carter was not a man who talked easily about things that mattered. Eleanor had learned that in the first week. He could talk about cattle and feed costs and weather patterns for an hour without pausing. But the moment a conversation moved toward anything real, anything that required him to open a door inside himself rather than just describe the landscape outside it, he went quiet in a particular way. Not cold, just careful. Like a man who had learned that some things once said could not be taken back, and had decided silence was the safer country. So when he sat down across from her that night with the letter from William Hayes between them and said, "Here's what I know," Eleanor understood that she was about to receive something that cost him something to give. She folded her hands in her lap and listened. 4 years ago, Thomas said, before Margaret died, this valley had 11 working ranches. Not counting the smaller operations, 11 proper ranches running significant cattle. He paused. Today, there are 4. Eleanor said nothing. She waited. 7 ranches gone in 4 years, Thomas continued. Not because the men who owned them were bad ranchers. 3 of them were better ranchers than I'll ever be. They went because they got squeezed out. Bad loans that came due at wrong moments. Land disputes that appeared out of nowhere with paperwork nobody could explain. Buyers who showed up with offers that seemed reasonable until you looked at what the land was actually worth and realized you'd sold $1 for a dime. His jaw tightened. William Hayes was involved in all of it, not always with his name on the paper, but he was there. You can prove that, Eleanor asked. I couldn't prove anything, Thomas said. That's the problem. The men who lost their ranches, most of them left the valley. Couple of them have property disputes still unresolved. One man, fellow named Daniel Corr, he tried to fight it. Hired a lawyer out of Billings. The lawyer took his money and disappeared, and the case never went anywhere. He looked at the letter. Daniel Corr is working as a laborer in Butte now. He had 400 acres and 2,000 head of cattle. Eleanor picked up the letter from Hayes and read it again. More slowly this time, looking at the particular words he'd chosen. The particular threats he'd wrapped in the language of concern. He calls it embarrassing, she said. He says certain information about my reasons for coming here could prove embarrassing. That's him saying he knows about Gerald Hatch, Thomas said flatly. He knows you came out here to marry a man who didn't want you. He's planning to use it, make it look like you came here under false pretenses, make it look like I was naive enough to take in a woman with an agenda. He paused. Or worse. He wants your land, Eleanor said. He's been wanting my land for 2 years. I'm one of 4 ranches left, and mine sits on the best water source in this part of the valley. There's a creek runs through my north pasture that doesn't dry up in summer, never freezes solid in winter. Whoever controls that water controls grazing rights for 50 square miles. His voice was level, but his hands, she noticed, had closed into loose fists on the table. He's offered to buy me out 3 times. I've refused 3 times. And now you've shown up, and he's decided that's either an opportunity or a problem. Or both, Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her. I'm an opportunity if he can use me to discredit you, she said. And I'm a problem if I'm useful to you. Because a man with organized accounts and identified savings and someone managing his operation properly is harder to squeeze than a man running on grief and neglected paperwork. She set the letter down. He wants me gone before I become more useful than I already am. There was a pause. You worked that out quickly, Thomas said. I work most things out quickly, Eleanor said. It's not always a comfortable trait. She looked at the letter again. Can I ask you something? Ask it. Gerald Hatch, the man I came here to marry. She kept her voice even. Is he involved with Hayes? The pause before Thomas answered was a fraction too long. I don't know for certain, he said. But Gerald Hatch bought new equipment 6 months ago that he couldn't have afforded on what his farm was bringing in. And 3 weeks before you arrived, he married Clara Dobbs, who is the niece of a man named Foster Dobbs, who is the closest thing William Hayes has to a business partner in this valley. He paused. Make of that what you will. Eleanor made of it exactly what it was. The letter she'd received in St. Louis, the careful, well-worded letter from Gerald Hatch about needing a capable woman and praying for someone like her, had not been a man looking for a wife. Or it had been that too. Maybe. Maybe Gerald Hatch had genuinely intended something at the start. But somewhere along the way, in the weeks or months between writing that letter and marrying Clara Dobbs, he had made a different choice. And the simplest explanation, the one that sat in Eleanor's stomach like a stone, was that her arrival in Harlan Creek had been engineered, not by Gerald, by someone who needed a reason to come after Thomas Carter and thought a woman with a complicated story and no local connections was a convenient tool. She had been used. She had suspected it since the platform. Now she was certain. "He used my life," Eleanor said quietly. "He moved me across 800 miles like a piece in a game I didn't know I was playing." "Yes," Thomas said. And the word was not gentle, but the way he said it was like he understood that she needed the truth more than she needed softening. "All right," Eleanor said. She reached across the table and picked up the letter and folded it in thirds and put it in her pocket. "I'm not leaving," she said. Thomas looked at her steadily. "Miss Whitmore, he offered me $50 to go back where I came from," Eleanor said. "I don't have a place to go back to. I gave up my room in St. Louis. I spent most of my savings on the train ticket. And even if I had somewhere to go, I would not go." She met his eyes. "I would not go because I have done nothing wrong, and I will not behave as though I have. And I would not go because William Hayes moved my life around a board without my permission, and I find that I am significantly angry about that." She paused. "I would like your permission to help you fight this." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "You understand what that means," he said. "What kind of man Hayes is. What he's already done to people who crossed him." "I understand. And you're still—" "I am still," Eleanor said firmly. "Yes." Thomas looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at her, and whatever he saw there, whatever he was measuring or weighing or trying to determine, settled something in him. "I'll get Pete in the morning," he said. "There are some things he knows that I haven't said out loud to anyone. And there's a man in town, a retired circuit judge named Avery Cross, who has no love for Hayes and has been watching what's happened in this valley for 3 years. He might be willing to talk." "Good," Eleanor said. "And in the meantime, I want to start with the paperwork. Whatever you have, deeds boundary surveys any correspondence with Hayes or his representatives. I want to go through all of it." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Tonight." Eleanor glanced at the clock on the shelf. It was nearly 9. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I'm going to write down everything I remember about Gerald Hatch's letter, the exact language, the specific promises, because I think that letter was not written by Gerald Hatch alone, and if I look at it carefully enough, I might be able to see whose hand was in it." Thomas looked at her for a moment that lasted just a beat longer than was strictly practical. "You're different than I thought you'd be," he said. "What did you think I'd be?" He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect or qualify. "Broken," he said. "Or going to be. I thought I was helping someone who needed time to recover, and then I'd put her on a train somewhere useful. And now—" Thomas Carter picked up his coffee cup, discovered it was empty, set it down again. "Now I think you might be the most dangerous person in this valley," he said. "And I mean that as a compliment." Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, a small and genuine smile. "Go to bed, Mr. Carter," she said. "We have a great deal of work to do tomorrow." The next morning arrived cold and sharp, and Eleanor was at the kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee and Gerald Hatch's letter reconstructed from memory in her own handwriting, every phrase she could recall before Thomas came downstairs. Pete came in from the yard 20 minutes later, stomping mud off his boots, and stopped short when he saw the spread of papers on the table. "Sit down, Pete," Thomas said. Pete sat down slowly, looking from Thomas to Eleanor, and back again, with the expression of a man who suspects he is about to be told something he is not going to enjoy. Thomas told him, Pete listened without interrupting, which Eleanor had already identified as one of his better qualities. When Thomas finished, Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're sure about Hayes and the hatch boy?" "Not entirely," Thomas said, "but it fits." Pete turned to Eleanor. "And you're not leaving?" "No," Eleanor said. Pete nodded slowly. He picked up one of the papers on the table, looked at it, set it back down. "All right then," he said, "because there's something I didn't tell you, Thomas, and I should have told you 8 months ago, and I didn't because I didn't want to worry you when you were already carrying enough." He paused. Dan Core came through the valley in March, passing through on his way to Butte. He stopped here one night. We talked. Thomas straightened. "You didn't tell me that." "No," Pete said. "I didn't. And I'm sorry for it." He put both hands flat on the table. Dan said Hayes had a man in the county records office. Someone who could alter documents, survey records, property boundaries, deed dates. He'd done it to at least 3 of the ranches that went under. Small changes, a boundary marker moved 50 feet, a deed date altered by a year. The kind of thing that wouldn't survive scrutiny, but caused enough confusion and delay that men without money for lawyers couldn't fight it. The kitchen was very quiet. "He has someone inside the records office," Eleanor said. Dan believed so. He couldn't prove it, but he knew his own boundary survey and what it said, and what showed up in the county records was not what his survey said. Eleanor looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Pete. And then they all looked at the stack of papers on the table, which suddenly had a different weight to it. "Do you have your original survey documents?" Eleanor asked Thomas. "The ones from when you first acquired the property." "Somewhere," Thomas said. "In the study. I'd have to look." "We need to find them," Eleanor said. "And we need to compare them to whatever is currently on file in the county records office. If Hayes has been moving boundaries, yours may already be altered and you wouldn't know it unless you had the originals to compare." Thomas stood up from the table. "Study," he said. "Come help me look." They spent 2 hours in the study, going through files and boxes and envelopes, with the focused intensity of people who understand that what they are looking for matters. Pete joined them after the first half hour, because Pete turned out to be the kind of man who once he's committed to something, commits with his whole body. Eleanor found the original survey documents in a wooden box under a pile of old correspondence, 3 maps, hand-drawn and meticulous, dated 1879, with the boundaries of the Carter Ranch marked in careful ink and signed by the surveyor. She spread them on the desk. "I need to see the county records," she said. "Do you have anything on file from the county office? Any copies they sent you?" Thomas found 2 letters from the county records office in a file at the back of the bottom drawer, sent in 1882 and 1884, both routine notifications. Eleanor unfolded them and read them and set them beside the original survey, and even without the official county record in front of her, she could see something. Or rather, she could see the beginning of the shape of something. "The language in this 1884 letter," she said, pointing. "This phrase here is established in current record. That's an unusual way to put it. Usually it would say as established in original survey or as established in deed. The word current is doing a lot of work in this sentence." Pete leaned over to look. "What does that mean?" "It means that in 1884, whatever was in the county record may already have been different from the original," Eleanor said. "It means someone may have been at the records as early as 4 years ago." She looked at Thomas. "Before Margaret died." Thomas sat down in the chair at the desk. That landed somewhere in him that changed the air in the room. Eleanor saw it and did not look away because she thought he needed someone not to look away. "He's been at this longer than I knew," Thomas said. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "And you've survived longer than he expected. That's why he's escalating." Thomas looked at the survey maps spread across his desk, and something in his face went from grief to something harder, cleaner, more useful. "What do we do?" he said. "We get Avery Cross," Eleanor said. "Today, if possible. I want to talk to him about the records office, whether there's a legal mechanism to request an independent survey and comparison. and I want to find out if any of the other ranchers who lost their properties kept their original documents." She paused. "If I can find enough documentation from enough sources, we don't need to prove Hayes did it. We need to prove the records were altered. That's a different case, and a stronger one." Pete made a sound that might have been approval. "Dan Core would talk to you," he said. "If you were serious, he's got nothing left to lose." "Write him a letter," Eleanor said. "Tell him I'd like to speak with him. Tell him we're building something." Thomas stood up from the chair. "I'll go into town," he said. "I'll find Cross." "I'll go with you," Eleanor said. Thomas looked at her, and she could see him calculating the talk it would cause, the attention it would draw, whether he should tell her to stay behind for her own protection. "I'm going with you," she said again, before he could say what he was thinking. "I wasn't going to argue," he said. "You were about to." He paused. "I was considering it." "Consider it settled," Eleanor said, and went to get her coat. Avery Cross was not what Eleanor had expected. She had built a mental image of a circuit judge from the way Thomas described him, retired, watching, waiting, and had expected something imposing. What she found instead was a small, compact man of about 65, with silver hair, and the deliberate hands of someone who has spent decades holding things carefully. He received them in the front room of his house on the east side of town, and he looked at Eleanor when Thomas introduced her with an attention that was not the assessing look she usually got, but something more like recognition. "You're the woman Hayes wrote to," Cross said. Eleanor blinked. "Beg your pardon?" "He wrote to me as well," Cross said. "Last week, suggesting I might have an interest in discouraging certain newcomers from involving themselves in Valley business." He sat back. "I burned the letter, as I do most things Hayes sends me, but I kept in mind that he'd sent it." He looked at Eleanor. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore. Tell me what you found." She told him. She told him about the original surveys and the 1884 letter and the language that didn't match. She told him about Daniel Core and what Pete had said about the records office. She told him about the 7 ranches in 4 years and the pattern of documentation failures that preceded each loss. She did not dramatize. She laid it out as she would lay out an account book, item by item, with sources noted and gaps clearly labeled. Cross listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You have a good mind," he said. "I've been told it's wasted," Eleanor said pleasantly. Cross looked at Thomas. "She's right that it's a different case than going after Hayes directly. Going after the records is cleaner, more defensible." He paused. "There's a problem." "There's always a problem," Thomas said. "The county records office is run by a man named Leonard Pratt," Cross said. "Leonard Pratt has worked in that office for 19 years. He has a family and a comfortable situation and has no obvious reason to be in anyone's pocket." He folded his hands. "He also bought a new house 2 years ago on a county clerk's salary." "So he is in the pocket," Eleanor said. "I've suspected so for some time, but suspicion and proof are different countries." Cross looked at Eleanor. "What you're proposing would require demonstrating not just that the records were wrong, but that they were deliberately altered. That means finding the original documents and finding someone who can testify to what the records used to say before they changed." "I have Thomas's original surveys," Eleanor said. "And if Daniel Core still has his, and if any of the other displaced ranchers kept theirs." "It's possible," Cross said. "It's more than anyone else has managed to assemble." He paused. "There's also the matter of Gerald Hatch." Eleanor kept her expression even. "What about him?" "Hayes doesn't use people carelessly," Cross said. "If Gerald Hatch was connected to your arrival here, if your coming to Harlan Creek was part of Hayes's design, then Hatch knows something useful. The question is whether he would say it." He looked at Eleanor carefully. "That's a difficult thing to ask. To speak to the man who abandoned you. To ask him to help you." "I understand that," Eleanor said. "Is it something you could do?" Eleanor thought about Gerald Hatch's letter with its careful promises and its borrowed sincerity. She thought about sitting on the platform in the dark with a torn letter in her lap. She thought about the $50 William Hayes thought her life was worth. "Yes," she said. "I could do it." Cross nodded slowly. "Then here is what I think we need," he said, and began to talk, and Eleanor listened and watched him lay out the shape of something that was not yet a plan, but was beginning to become one. And outside the window the town of Harlan Creek went about its ordinary business entirely unaware that in this small front room, a woman who had arrived with nothing, and a rancher who had been slowly losing everything, and an old judge who had been waiting for the right moment, were sitting together and deciding what they were going to do about it. She had been in Harlan Creek for 6 weeks when the first real challenge came. Not from Hayes, not yet. The first real challenge came from the town itself, and it came in the form of a woman named Constance Alderman, who was the wife of the largest merchant in town, and who had appointed herself the social conscience of Harlan Creek, with the particular energy of someone who has found a role they were born for. Eleanor had gone into town alone that morning to collect mail and purchase a few supplies, and stop by the post office to confirm a letter she'd sent to Daniel Corr had gone out. She was coming out of the dry goods store when Constance Alderman materialized on the boardwalk ahead of her, with 2 other women flanking her like a practiced formation. "Miss Whitmore," Constance said in a voice pitched to Carrie without appearing to try. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course," Eleanor said. "Several of us have been concerned," Constance said, tilting her chin at the precise angle that means I am being kind, and you should appreciate it. "About your situation. About what it must look like a woman without family or proper connections, living under the roof of an unmarried man." She paused for effect. "There are people talking, you understand, about what sort of woman would do such a thing." Eleanor looked at the 3 of them. She looked at Constance Alderman with her careful dress and her significant chin and her 2 loyal attendants, and she thought about the platform in the dark and the torn letter and Gerald Hatch and William Hayes and the 7 ranches and Daniel Corr working in Butte. She thought about Pete and the barn in the rain and Avery Cross and his careful hands. She thought about what she had done in the last 6 weeks and what she intended to do in the weeks ahead. And then she said very calmly, "Mrs. Alderman, I appreciate your concern. Thomas Carter offered me work and shelter when I had neither, and I have repaid that generosity by reorganizing his accounts, managing his household, identifying a supplier arrangement that will save him a significant sum by year's end, and contributing what skills I have to the running of an operation that supports several families in this valley." She paused. "If there are people talking about what sort of woman would do such a thing, I hope they conclude that she is the sort of woman who works hard and is grateful for the opportunity to do so." She smiled pleasantly. "Was there anything else?" Constance Alderman opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. "People simply feel—" "I understand," Eleanor said. "Good morning, Mrs. Alderman." She walked away. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she turned the corner, and she put them in her pockets so no one would see, and she stood for a moment against the side of a building and breathed. Then she thought about what Constance Alderman might say to her husband that evening, about what her husband might say to other men in town, about the particular way that social disapproval in a small valley could be weaponized. She thought about Hayes. She thought he didn't need to buy all of those men out. He only needed enough people to stop believing in them. She straightened up and walked to the post office. There was a letter waiting for her. Not from Daniel Corr, it was too soon for that. This letter was on plain paper, no return address, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Eleanor opened it on the street outside the post office because she had decided she was done with surprises. Inside was a single line. "If you want to know what Hayes has on Hatch, ask Hatch's wife." No signature. Eleanor read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket, with the deliberate care of someone adding a piece to a puzzle she cannot yet see the full shape of, and she walked back to where she'd tied Thomas's horse and climbed up and turned toward the ranch, and her mind was moving at the particular speed it moved when things were starting to connect. Clara Dobbs Hatch, Hayes's business partner's niece. married to Gerald Hatch 3 weeks before Eleanor arrived. Eleanor had assumed Clara Dobbs was an innocent participant in Gerald's defection, a woman who wanted a husband and found one without knowing or caring about the damage it caused. But the letter changed that assumption, or rather, it cracked it open enough to look at what was inside. If you want to know what Hayes has on Hatch, not what Hatch knows, what Hayes has on him. Gerald Hatch had not abandoned Eleanor because he fell in love with Clara Dobbs. Or not only that. Gerald Hatch had abandoned Eleanor because William Hayes had something on him, and marrying Foster Dobbs' niece was the price of Hayes leaving him alone. She had not been abandoned by a man who chose someone else. She had been abandoned by a man who was afraid. Eleanor sat straighter on the horse and let that land. It didn't make it hurt less, but it made it make sense in a different way. And sense, even painful sense, was something she could work with. She rode back to the ranch in the cold afternoon air, and by the time she reached the yard, she had already decided what she was going to do next. She was going to find Clara Dobbs Hatch. Not Gerald. Clara. Because whatever Gerald knew, Clara might know more, and Clara was a woman who had been placed in her position by the same man who had placed Eleanor in hers, and women who had been moved around a board by the same hand sometimes found when they finally met each other that they had more in common than anyone expected. Thomas was in the yard when she rode in, talking to Pete about something that made both of them stop and look up when she came through the gate. She could see from the set of Thomas's shoulders that something had happened in her absence. "What is it?" she said, pulling up. Thomas looked at her for a moment. "We had a visitor," he said. "Hayes. No, one of his men." He paused. "He came to tell me that my property taxes have been reassessed. The county is saying I owe back taxes going 2 years, a sum I don't have liquid." Eleanor stared at him. Pete said flatly, "It's manufactured, has to be." "Of course it is," Thomas said. "But manufactured or not, if I can't pay it within 60 days, they can move against the property." He looked at Eleanor. "That's what Hayes does when he can't move someone out socially or legally. He uses the tax mechanism, gets someone in the county assessor's office to reassess, creates a debt you can't meet." His voice was level, but his eyes were not. "I've watched him do it to 2 other ranches." Eleanor climbed down from the horse. She was quiet for a moment, standing in the yard with the cold wind off the mountains pressing against her back. And she thought about 60 days, and she thought about Avery Cross, and she thought about the unsigned letter in her pocket, and Clara Dobbs Hatch, and 7 ranches, and a man in Butte who used to have 400 acres. "All right," she said. Thomas and Pete both looked at her. "We were building something, and now we need to build it faster," she said. "Pete write to Daniel Corr today, not a letter, a telegram. Can you reach him by telegraph?" "I can find out." "Find out." "Thomas, I need to see your tax records going back 5 years. Everything you have. And then I need you to take me to Avery Cross tomorrow morning." She paused. "And I need you to tell me where Gerald Hatch lives." Thomas blinked. "Why?" "Because I need to speak to his wife," Eleanor said. "And I need to do it before Hayes realizes I have a reason to." The 2 men looked at each other. "She's right," Pete said after a moment. "Whatever we're doing, we need to do it faster than Hayes expects." Thomas looked at Eleanor. In his face was something that had not been there 6 weeks ago. Not just respect, which had come earlier, but something else. Something that was harder to name because it lived behind the careful eyes and the even voice and the working hands in the part of Thomas Carter that he had decided 4 years ago on the night his wife and his son died in a winter storm that he was done with. It was trust. He nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "We go to Cross tomorrow. Tonight come inside, and let's look at the tax records." They went inside. And outside, the wind came down off the mountains, and the sun went low behind the ridgeline. And in 60 days, William Hayes intended to own this land. He did not know what was coming for him. Neither entirely did Eleanor Whitmore. But she was learning. The tax records told a story. Eleanor had known they would. Numbers always told a story if you knew how to read them. and Eleanor had been reading numbers since she was 9 years old, sitting at her father's kitchen table, working through his account books, because he trusted her arithmetic more than his own. She had spread Thomas's tax records across the kitchen table after supper that night. 5 years of assessments, payments, receipts, and she had sat with them for 2 hours while Thomas watched from across the table and Pete leaned against the doorframe, drinking coffee. He didn't need it that hour. And what she found was both exactly what she expected and worse than she'd allowed herself to imagine. Your assessed value jumped 38% between last October and this month, she said. Not this year's assessment, it was changed retroactively. Someone went back into the October record and altered the figure. She pointed to 2 lines on different documents. Look at the ink. Look at the way the numbers sit on the line. The original entry and the corrected entry were not written by the same hand. Thomas leaned forward and looked where she was pointing. I can't see it, he said. You're not looking for what the number says, Eleanor said. You're looking at how it was written. The original assessor, whoever wrote the October entry, pressed lighter on his pen. He made his 7s with a clean crossing stroke. These corrected figures press harder, and the 7s have a small hook at the bottom. She set the 2 pages side by side. 2 different people. One of them went back and changed a number that had already been recorded. Pete set down his coffee cup. Can you prove that to someone who matters? He asked. I can demonstrate it clearly enough that a reasonable person would have serious questions, Eleanor said. Whether that constitutes proof in a legal sense is Cross's territory, not mine. She paused. But this gives us something to bring him tomorrow that's stronger than what we had this morning. Thomas was still looking at the 2 pages. I paid every tax bill on time, he said. Every one. I have receipts for all of it. I know you do, Eleanor said. And your receipts show the amount you paid against the original assessment. But what's now on record in the county office is a higher number, which means your payments, even though they were correct at the time, are now technically short of what the record says you owe. She looked at him. That's the trap. He didn't need to forge a new bill. He just needed to change the old one. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's elegant, Pete said in the tone of a man who hates what he is admiring. It is, Eleanor agreed. Whoever designed it understood that a clean forgery is less useful than a retroactive correction, because a correction can always be explained as a clerical error. No crime was committed. The number was simply wrong, and now it's right. The burden falls on you to prove the original was correct. She paused. Which is why we need your original receipts, and we need Cross, and we need Daniel Corr's documents, because one man with original receipts looks like a dispute. 5 men with original receipts that all contradict the current county record looks like a pattern. Thomas looked at her across the table, and she could see him thinking, working through it the way a man works through something when he is finally beginning to see the shape of the whole thing, instead of just the piece in front of him. He's done this to all of them, Thomas said. The ones who lost their ranches. This is how he did it. I believe so, Eleanor said. Yes. Thomas stood up from the table slowly. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to them, and Eleanor let him stand there because she understood that there are moments when a person needs to feel the full weight of something before they can decide what to do about it. When he turned around, his face was different. Not harder exactly. More settled, like a man who has finally stopped arguing with the weather and decided to put on his coat. In the morning, he said. In the morning, Eleanor agreed. She stacked the papers carefully and tied them with the piece of twine she had brought down from the study and set the bundle at the end of the table where it would be ready, and she went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about Clara Dobbs Hatch. Avery Cross received them early. He was already at his desk when they arrived. He was the kind of man who was always already at his desk. Eleanor suspected who had been arriving early to things for so many decades that early had simply become when he existed. And he looked at the papers Eleanor spread in front of him with an expression that went from careful attention to sharper attention over the course of about 4 minutes. Same hand on the correction, he said, holding the 2 pages to the light from the window. Yes, Eleanor said. And you have the original receipts showing payment against the first figure. All 5 years, paid within 30 days of each assessment every time. Cross set the pages down. He looked at Thomas. I know a man in Helena who handles exactly this kind of case. He is not cheap and he is not fast, but he has never lost a property dispute in 12 years of practice. He paused. The problem is 60 days. Is it enough time? Thomas asked. To win number. Cross picked up the pages again. To file an injunction that freezes the collection process while the dispute is under review possibly. If we can get the original records from Core and at least 2 other former ranchers. He looked at Eleanor. How quickly can you reach them? Pete sent a telegram to Core last night, Eleanor said. If Core responds quickly and has his documents, he could potentially be here within 2 weeks. The others I don't know yet where they are. She paused. But I have another avenue I haven't tried yet. Cross looked at her. Gerald Hatch's wife, Eleanor said. Cross was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that careful, recognizing attention he'd had since the first time they met. You got the letter, he said. Eleanor blinked. You know about the letter. I sent it, Cross said. The room went very still. Thomas turned to look at Cross with an expression Eleanor had not seen on him before. Avery, he said very quietly. I've known Clara Dobbs since she was 12 years old, Cross said without apology. Her mother was a decent woman who married a man who wasn't. When Clara married Hatch, I knew what it meant. I knew Foster Dobbs was involved. And I suspected, though I couldn't prove it, that the arrangement was not entirely voluntary. He folded his hands on the desk. 3 weeks ago, Clara came to see me. She came alone, and she told me she had information about Hayes and about what her uncle had agreed to on her behalf and on Hatch's behalf, and she wanted to know if there was anyone she could tell it to that Hayes wouldn't be able to silence. Cross paused. I told her about you, Miss Whitmore. And I told her I thought you might be someone worth talking to. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. She knows what Hayes has on Hatch, Eleanor said. She knows considerably more than that, Cross said. But she's frightened. Her uncle has made clear what happens to people in this valley who cross Hayes. She needs to believe there is something substantial enough to protect her before she'll speak formally. He looked at Eleanor. She might speak to you informally, woman to woman, without it going anywhere yet. Thomas said, she's asking Eleanor to take the risk of approaching her while Hayes is already watching Eleanor. Yes, Cross said. I'm aware of that. I'll do it, Eleanor said. Eleanor, Thomas started. I'll do it, she said again and looked at Thomas steadily. She came forward. She's frightened, and she came forward anyway. The least I can do is meet her halfway. She paused. And if what she knows is what I think it might be, it changes everything. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. She could see the thing in him that wanted to say, let me protect you, and the thing in him that was beginning to understand that she did not need protecting from decisions she had made with clear eyes. He said nothing, which was, Eleanor was learning one of the things she respected most about him. Cross wrote a note. Eleanor carried it. She went alone because Cross said it needed to be alone. 2 women meeting for coffee in town was an ordinary thing. A man accompanying one of them made it a meeting, and a meeting would reach Hayes's ears before the cups were cold. She went in the middle of the morning when the town was busy, and she tied Thomas's horse at the rail in front of the dry goods store, and she went to the small tea room on the south side of the main street that Margaret Sully had once told her was where the women of Harlan Creek gathered on Thursday mornings. This was a Wednesday. Clara Hatch was already there. She was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 20 at most, 22, with the careful, composed look of a woman who has learned to hold her face still in public. She was pretty in an unremarkable way, the kind of pretty that does not attract immediate attention, and she was dressed well, and she had her hands folded around a cup she wasn't drinking from when Eleanor came through the door. Their eyes met. Eleanor sat down across from her without preamble. She ordered coffee from the woman who came over, waited until the woman went away, and then said quietly and directly, "I appreciate you coming." Clara Hatch said just as quietly, "I've been wanting to talk to you since you arrived. I didn't know how." "Then let's not waste time," Eleanor said. "Tell me what you know." Clara looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "My uncle told Hayes about you 6 months ago," she said. "About the letter Gerald sent to St. Louis. It wasn't Gerald didn't write that letter as part of a plan. He wrote it honestly. He genuinely wanted a wife." She paused. "But when my uncle found out, he went to Hayes, and Hayes saw it as an opportunity." "An opportunity to do what exactly?" Eleanor said. "To establish a reason to go after Thomas Carter's reputation," Clara said. "If an abandoned woman, a woman with no connections and nowhere to go, turned up at his ranch, it would create a scandal. People would question his character. It would make the tax situation easier to pursue because a man whose reputation is damaged has less community support when he tries to fight the county." She paused. "And if the woman left quickly enough, humiliated enough, she might say things in passing to the station clerk, to people in town that would color how people saw Thomas." Her voice dropped lower. "Hayes was going to ensure you had no reason to stay." Eleanor thought about the $50 letter, about the man on the barrel, about Constance Alderman on the boardwalk. "He set the social pressure in motion too," Eleanor said. "Yes." "And Gerald," Eleanor said carefully. "Gerald knew." Clara's jaw tightened. "Gerald knew after," she said. "He didn't know what Hayes planned to do with the situation he'd created. When he found out when my uncle explained what Hayes intended, he wanted to warn you. He wrote a letter." She stopped. "Hayes's man intercepted it." Eleanor sat very still. There had been a letter. Gerald Hatch had tried to warn her. It had never arrived. She folded that information away in a separate place, inside herself, not discarding it, not dwelling on it, just placing it where she could come back to it when she had time, because right now she needed to stay on what mattered. "What does Hayes have on Gerald?" she asked. Clara looked at the window. When she looked back, her eyes were steady and unhappy and very clear. "Gerald borrowed money from Hayes 3 years ago," she said. "Before any of this. His farm was struggling. Hayes offered a loan at favorable terms." She paused. The terms were not what Gerald thought they were. Hayes has a document that Gerald signed. Gerald says he didn't read it carefully enough, and I believe him because Gerald is not a careful man about paperwork, which is one of his genuine failings that gives Hayes a claim on Gerald's property if the loan isn't repaid in full within a period that already passed. "Hayes can take his farm," Eleanor said. "Hayes has been able to take his farm for 2 years, Clara said. "He just hasn't because as long as Gerald is cooperative, it's more useful to keep him as a cooperative neighbor than to dispossess him." She met Eleanor's eyes. "My marriage was the price of Hayes continuing to not foreclose." Eleanor looked at her. "Clara," she said, and it was the first time she'd used the name, and she said it the way she would have said it to a woman she had known for years. "Are you willing to say this to a judge?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "I'm frightened," she said. "I know. My uncle has a very long reach in this valley." "I know that too," Eleanor said. "But we are building something, and if what you know is what I think it is, what you have to say is the piece that turns a collection of suspicious documents into a case." She paused. "You don't have to decide today. But I need you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there are people who will stand with you." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, something young and frightened making room for something a little older and more decided. "Gerald wants to help," Clara said. "He's ashamed. He knows what his fear cost you, and he hasn't slept properly since you arrived in town. He would speak if I did." She paused. "We would both speak, together." Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's folded ones for just a moment, not long, just long enough to say, "I heard you in the language that needed no words." "Then go home," Eleanor said. "Keep this between us for now. Tell Gerald nothing has been decided, and wait to hear from me." She left the tea room and walked to her horse and rode back toward the ranch, and somewhere between the edge of town and the beginning of the ranch road, she realized her hands were completely steady on the reins. She noted this with a small private satisfaction. 6 weeks ago, on a platform in the dark, she had been shaking so hard she could barely hold a torn letter. Now she was riding back from a meeting that had just changed the shape of everything, and her hands were steady. She was not the same woman who had stepped off that train. Thomas and Pete were both in the yard when she rode in. She could tell from the way they were standing that something had happened. "What?" she said before she was even off the horse. "Ryder came from town while you were gone," Pete said. "Man named Briggs, works for Hayes." He paused. "He came to tell Thomas that Hayes is prepared to offer a settlement. Full cancellation of the back taxes in exchange for signing a preliminary option agreement on the ranch." Eleanor climbed down. "An option agreement gives Hayes the right to purchase the property at a fixed price within 18 months, Thomas said. His voice was even, but his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working very hard to stay controlled. "Price he's naming is about 40 cents on the dollar." "He's getting impatient," Eleanor said. "Or he knows something we don't," Pete said. Eleanor handed Pete the reins and turned to Thomas. "He doesn't know what I learned this morning," she said. "And we have maybe 48 hours before he finds out that I spoke to Clara Hatch, so we need to use that time." She started for the house. "Get Cross. Bring him here if you can. Tonight." "Eleanor." Thomas caught her arm gently, briefly, a touch that was over before she had time to register surprise at it. She turned. His hand dropped. "Tell me what happened." She told him. She told him about Clara and the letter that had been intercepted, and Gerald's coerced signature, and the option agreement, and what Clara and Gerald were willing to do if the moment was right. She told him quickly and clearly, and she watched his face move through a range of expressions. Anger at Hayes, something complicated about Gerald Hatch, and then at the end, something she couldn't name, but that made the air between them feel different than it had before. "He tried to warn you," Thomas said. "Yes." "And Hayes stopped it." "Yes." Thomas was quiet. "That doesn't change what happened to you on that platform." "No," Eleanor said. "It doesn't. But it changes what Gerald is, which matters for what comes next." She paused. "He's not a villain. He's a man who was afraid and made poor choices, and has been living with them. That makes him useful because it means he has something left to lose that isn't money." Thomas looked at her. "What does he have left to lose?" "His wife," Eleanor said simply. "He made a choice that cost someone else enormously, and the woman who paid the price is now offering him a chance to be better than he was. Men who are not entirely lost generally want to take that chance." She paused. "Or at least, they want to. Thomas was looking at her in the way she was beginning to recognize that still careful, behind-the-eyes looking that he did when he was processing something beyond the surface of it. "You are not angry at him," Thomas said. It was not quite a question. "I'm not angry," Eleanor said honestly. "But I have bigger things to be angry about. And anger that isn't directed at something useful is just weather." Something that was not quite a smile moved across Thomas's face, brief, warm, gone again. "I'll ride for Cross," he said. Cross arrived before dark. The four of them, Cross, Thomas, Pete, and Eleanor, sat at the kitchen table, and Cross listened to everything Eleanor had brought back from the tea room, and he was quiet for a long time afterward, in the particular way of a man who is arranging something inside his mind. Clara Hatch's testimony, combined with Gerald's account of the coerced signature, changes the nature of the case, he said finally. It's no longer just a property dispute with suspicious documentation. It's a pattern of criminal coercion. He paused. What I want to do is file two things simultaneously: an injunction on the tax collection and a formal complaint to the territorial court about the conduct of the county records office. If we can file both on the same day, Hayes can't counter one without drawing attention to the other. How long to prepare both? Thomas asked. 10 days, Cross said. If Daniel Corr responds and has his documents, if Gerald and Clara commit formally, if we can locate even one other displaced rancher with original papers. I have a name, Pete said. Everyone looked at him. When Dan Corr came through in March, he mentioned a man named Sam Ellery. Had a ranch to the north, lost it 18 months ago. He's somewhere in the Bitterroot Valley, has family there. He paused. I know a man who might know where. Send word tonight, Eleanor said. I'll ride myself, Pete said and stood up. Pete, Thomas said. Pete paused. Thank you, Thomas said. It was not a small thing the way he said it. Pete nodded once briefly and went out. Cross looked at Eleanor across the table. There is something I have not told you yet, he said. Something I have been considering how to say. Eleanor waited. I know William Hayes, Cross said. Not in the way you know a neighbor. In the way you know an opponent you have been watching for a long time. He paused. He was not always what he is now. 20 years ago he was a legitimate businessman in Missouri. He married well. He had children. Another pause. His wife left him, took the children. The divorce was ugly and public. He lost the house, the business, most of what he had, and he came west with very little and rebuilt himself through methods that were not always legitimate. He paused. I tell you this, not to excuse him, but because a man who was once destroyed by circumstances he could not control and rebuilt himself through dominance and manipulation is a man who understands exactly what it means to take something from someone and exactly what it costs the person you take it from. He looked at Eleanor. Which means when this comes to light, and it will come to light, he will not go quietly, and he will not be kind about it. He will try to destroy whatever he can reach before he goes down. The kitchen was very still. What can he reach? Thomas asked. Cross looked at him steadily. You, your reputation, your ranch, anything he can damage as leverage to make you withdraw. He paused. And Miss Whitmore. Eleanor said, what can he do to me that he hasn't already tried? He can make the story of why you came here so public and so ugly that even if you win the legal case, you can't stay in this valley, Cross said. He can ensure that every person in Harlan Creek knows about Gerald Hatch and the platform and the abandoned bride in language designed to make you look either foolish or calculating. Either you were naive enough to come 800 miles for a man who didn't want you, or you came here with a plan to attach yourself to a wealthy rancher under false pretenses. He paused. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be said often enough. Eleanor looked at the table. She thought about Constance Alderman on the boardwalk. She thought about the man on the barrel. She thought about what Margaret Sully had said. People are wondering about the arrangement, and how easy it would be to take that wondering and twist it into something that couldn't be untwisted. She thought about being 25 years old and already very tired. And then she thought about Daniel Corr in Butte, with nothing left, and Clara Hatch at a table with her hands folded around a cup she wasn't drinking from, and Gerald's letter that never arrived, and 7 ranches in 4 years, and Thomas standing in the hallway, saying under my protection to a man she never saw. Then we move before he does, Eleanor said. Cross looked at her. We don't wait for him to attack and respond, she said. We go to the community before he does. Not legally, that comes when Cross is ready, but socially. She paused. There are women in this town who don't know what Hayes has done to the ranches that are gone. They've seen their neighbors leave and they've assumed hard times or poor decisions. If they understood what actually happened, if the women of this valley understood that what happened to the Corrs and the Ellerys could happen to any one of their families, then Hayes's social campaign against me lands differently, because I'm not a scandalous woman with a questionable story. I'm the woman who found out what was happening and tried to stop it. Thomas was looking at her with that careful, behind-the-eyes look again. You want to tell the story before he can tell it, Thomas said. I want to tell the truth before he can replace it with a version of events that serves him, Eleanor said. Yes. Cross was quiet for a moment. It's risky, he said. If Hayes realizes what you're doing before we're ready to file, then we need to be ready to file sooner, Eleanor said. I'll find the language for the injunction with you. I'll help prepare the complaint. What you can do in 10 days, I can help you do in 7. She looked at Cross, then at Thomas. But we can't let him control the narrative. He has used that as his primary weapon against all of these men. He doesn't just take their land. He takes people's belief in them first, so that when the land goes, nobody fights for them. She paused. That won't happen here. Cross looked at her for a long moment. Your mother raised a remarkable woman, he said. My mother told me I asked too many questions, Eleanor said. Mothers are frequently wrong, Cross said, and stood up and began gathering his coat. It was Thomas who walked Cross to the door, and Eleanor stayed at the table and looked at the lamp burning steady in front of her and thought about what came next. She was making a list in her mind, the kind of list she made when the task was large enough that she needed to organize it before she could begin it. And she was on the 3rd item when Thomas came back into the kitchen. He didn't sit down. He stood on the other side of the table and looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was a beat longer than comfortable and a beat shorter than anything else. Eleanor, he said. She had noticed without making particular note of it when he had begun using her first name. It had happened gradually, somewhere between the 3rd week and the 4th. The way some things happen between people who are spending a great deal of time working closely together. The formal address, softening by degrees. Until one morning, you realize the formality is gone, and neither of you marked the exact moment it left. Yes, she said. If this gets worse before it gets better, Thomas said. If Hayes comes after you directly in a way that if it costs you something, you can't get back. He stopped, started again. I need you to know that I will not let that happen without consequence for him, whatever it takes. Eleanor looked at him. Thomas, she said, I did not come here. I did not stay here because I needed someone to protect me from the consequences of doing the right thing. I know that, he said. Then don't offer me protection, she said. Stand beside me. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. Can I do both? He said. Eleanor looked at him. This man with the working hands and the careful eyes and the 4 years of grief he carried like a stone in his coat pocket, and something moved in her chest that she didn't fully look at because it was too new to look at directly. Yes, she said. I think you can. She gathered the papers on the table and went to her room. And 40 miles away, William Hayes sat in his well-appointed office and looked at the report his man had brought him. The woman was still at the ranch. The judge had been visited twice. The tax gambit had not moved Carter as expected, and he felt for the first time in a long campaign the prickle of something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly. Something adjacent to it. He had taken 7 ranches from 7 men, and not one of them had built something before he could stop them. He had not, when he dispatched Gerald Hatch's letter to Missouri, accounted for the particular kind of woman who would answer it. He opened his desk drawer and took out a clean sheet of paper. It was time to stop being subtle. The clean sheet of paper became a letter, and the letter reached Harlan Creek 2 days later. Not to Thomas, not to Avery Cross, not even to Eleanor directly. It went to every merchant, every landowner, every man of standing in the valley, whose name appeared on any civic record Hayes could access. And it arrived on the same morning, delivered by the same rider who made the circuit of the valley before breakfast, so that by the time the sun was fully up, the letter had been read in 11 households, and its contents were moving through town like water finding the lowest ground. Eleanor learned about it from Margaret Sully. She had gone into town alone that morning. She had been going into town alone regularly now, deliberately, because a woman who hides gives people a reason to wonder what she's hiding. And Margaret Sully met her at the door of the dry goods store with an expression that sat somewhere between apology and fascination. There's been a letter, Margaret said. Tell me what it says, Eleanor said. Margaret told her. Hayes had written in the measured, concerned tone of a civic-minded businessman that he had come into possession of certain troubling information regarding a woman currently residing at the Carter Ranch. That this woman had arrived in Harlan Creek under circumstances that were not what they appeared. That she had represented herself as a prospective bride to a local farmer, but had in fact harbored intentions of a more calculating nature. That her presence in Thomas Carter's household was the result of a deliberate campaign to attach herself to a man of property and means, and that certain documents in Hayes's possession indicated a pattern of behavior that stretched back to St. Louis, where the woman in question had left behind unresolved financial disputes. Unresolved financial disputes, Eleanor repeated. That's what the letter says. Margaret confirmed. I haven't seen the letter myself. My husband has. He told me. And what did your husband make of it? Margaret Sully looked at Eleanor with the particular careful look of a woman who is deciding in real time how honest she is going to be. He's uncertain, Margaret said. Robert is a fair man, but he's uncertain. And the rest of the town? Divided, Margaret said. There are people who have known Thomas Carter for 15 years who won't believe a word of it. There are people who never quite trusted the situation from the start, and this confirms what they already thought. She paused. And there are people in the middle who are waiting to see what happens next. Eleanor nodded slowly. Thank you, Margaret, she said. That is exactly the information I needed. She bought nothing. She walked back out into the street. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and let the morning air come off the mountains, and she did not let herself feel the thing that wanted to be felt, the burn of it. The specific humiliation of seeing her name used this way publicly and deliberately in a letter designed to make her disappear. Because she didn't have time for that right now. She would have time for that later. Right now, she had a problem with a shape she could work with, and she was going to work with it. She went to Avery Cross's house. He had already read the letter by the time she arrived. His copy had come with a personal note at the bottom handwritten that said, simply, I would encourage you to reconsider your associations, Avery, for your own sake. Cross handed it to her without comment. Eleanor read it, read the main letter, set them both on his desk. He knows we're close, she said. This isn't a calculated move. This is a panic move. Cross tilted his head. How do you distinguish the two? A calculated move targets me with something specific, Eleanor said. Something that can be traced to a source that makes a particular claim he can back up if challenged. This, she gestured at the letter. This is broad. Unresolved financial disputes in St. Louis. Certain documents in his possession. It's constructed to sound substantive without being substantive because he doesn't actually have anything. He's hoping that people's existing doubts do the work for him. Cross looked at her with something that might have been pride. You're right, he said. He has nothing on you, Miss Whitmore, because there is nothing to have. That won't stop it from working if we give him enough time, Eleanor said. We need to move now, today if possible. What do we have? Cross looked at the stack of documents that had been growing on his desk for the past week. Daniel Corr had telegraphed back within 36 hours and was on a train from Butte with his original survey documents and deed. He was expected tomorrow. Pete had located Sam Ellery in the Bitterroot Valley, and Ellery had confirmed by letter that he had his original papers and would provide a sworn statement. They had Thomas's documents cross-referenced and annotated in Eleanor's hand. They had Cross's own notes from 3 years of watching Hayes operate. What they did not yet have formally was Clara and Gerald Hatch. I need to speak to Clara today, Eleanor said, before Hayes gets to Gerald first. Cross was already reaching for his pen. I'll write her a note. No, Eleanor said. No notes. If Hayes has someone watching their house and I think he does a note from your hand goes directly back to him. She paused. I'll go myself, unannounced. If I'm seen going to the Hatch farm, it looks like what it actually is, a woman visiting the wife of the man who was supposed to marry her. People will assume I'm angry or upset or making a scene. Nobody will assume I'm building a case. Cross looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this carefully, he said. I think about everything carefully, Eleanor said. It's the only advantage I've ever consistently had. She rode to the Hatch farm. It was a modest operation, a few miles east of town. She had gotten the directions from Pete without explaining why, and Pete had given them without asking which was one of the things she valued most about Pete. The farm was tidy, but strained. The particular strain that comes not from laziness, but from too much weight on too few resources, and she understood Gerald Hatch a little better for seeing it. Clara came to the door before Eleanor had finished tying her horse. She had been watching from the window. "He's here," Clara said before Eleanor could speak. "Inside. Gerald is inside. He came back from town an hour ago with Hayes's letter in his hand, and he's—" Her voice broke slightly and steadied. "He's frightened." "I know," Eleanor said. "Let me talk to him." Gerald Hatch was sitting at his kitchen table with Hayes's letter in front of him, and he looked up when Eleanor came through the door, and the expression on his face was the most honest thing she had seen in a long time. It was not the expression of a man caught in something shameful. It was the expression of a man who has been carrying something shameful for so long that he is almost relieved to stop pretending it isn't there. He was younger than she'd pictured, thin with hands that moved too much when he was nervous, which he was. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Eleanor sat down across from him without being invited, because this was not a social call. "I'm not here to discuss what you did," she said. "I'm not here to make you feel worse than you already do. I'm here because we have approximately 48 hours before William Hayes destroys something that took me Thomas Carter Avery Cross and 3 other families a great deal of effort to build. And I need to know if you're going to help us or not." Gerald looked at Clara, who was standing in the doorway. Clara nodded. Gerald looked back at Eleanor. "What do you need me to do?" "I need the original loan document," Eleanor said. "The one you signed with Hayes. The one that gives him a claim on this property." "He has it," Gerald said. "He took the original when I signed." "Did you keep a copy?" Gerald stopped. He was thinking. "Clara," he said. "The box in the bedroom. The one with the property papers. Is there a copy of anything from Hayes in there?" Clara disappeared. She came back 2 minutes later with a tin box. Gerald opened it and sorted through it with increasingly urgent hands. And then he stopped, and he pulled out a single folded paper. "A copy," he said. "I made a copy when I signed it. I didn't know why at the time. I had a feeling." Eleanor took the paper and read it. She read it twice. Her heart was beating faster than she would have liked. "Gerald," she said, "this document has a clause in it that I don't believe you were told about." "What clause?" "This clause here, paragraph 4, says that if Hayes calls the loan due and you don't pay within 30 days, he has the right to transfer the debt to any other note holder at his discretion." She looked at him. "Do you understand what that means?" Gerald shook his head. "It means Hayes can sell your debt to himself under a different name," Eleanor said. "He can foreclose on your property, not as William Hayes, but as whatever business entity he creates. It breaks the chain of evidence connecting him to the seizure. By the time anyone traces it back, the property has changed hands twice, and Hayes's name isn't on the deed." She set the document down. "He's done this before. It's how he kept his name off the other ranches. The land doesn't go to Hayes, it goes to a company called Harlan Creek Land Holdings, which is Hayes, but it takes a lawyer and a great deal of time to prove that." The kitchen was very quiet. "He was going to take everything," Gerald said. Not a question. "Yes," Eleanor said. "The marriage to Clara, it bought you time and it bought you compliance. But it was never going to save you." She paused. "The only thing that saves you is what you do in the next 2 days." Gerald put his face in his hands for a moment. Clara crossed the room and put her hand on his shoulder, and Eleanor watched this small, quiet act of a wife standing with her husband in a bad moment. And she felt something that was not quite forgiveness, and not quite the absence of anger, but was some third thing that had elements of both. Gerald raised his head. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "Tell me what you need," he said. Eleanor told him. She was back at the Carter Ranch by early afternoon. Thomas was waiting for her in the yard. She had learned that he often ended up in the yard when she was in town, that he had a way of finding reasons to be outside when she was due back, though he would never have said so. And he read her face before she said a word. "You got them," he said. "Both of them," Eleanor said. "Gerald has a copy of the original loan document with a clause in it that explains exactly how Hayes was going to hide his tracks after the foreclosure." "It's Thomas. It's very damning. Cross needs to see it tonight." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously, the way he always considered things seriously when she said them, and she appreciated it, because he wasn't asking out of habit. He was actually asking. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm better than I've been since I got off that train." She paused. "I'm angry and I'm focused, and those two things together seem to work very well in me." Thomas nodded. The corner of his mouth moved. "That's what Pete says," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "Pete said something about me. Pete said, and I am quoting him directly because he would want it quoted accurately, that you're the most organized, angry person he has ever encountered, and he means that as the highest compliment he knows how to give." Eleanor felt something warm move through her chest. "Tell Pete I said thank you," she said. That evening, with Daniel Corr, arrived from Butte, a quiet, worn man with the careful eyes of someone who has been beaten by something large and is still in the process of deciding whether to stay beaten. They gathered at Cross's house. Corr brought his survey documents. Eleanor brought Gerald's copy of the loan agreement. Cross spread everything across his desk, and they stood around it, all of them, and Cross went through each piece methodically, his finger moving along lines of ink, and the room was very quiet. When he finished, he straightened up. "We file tomorrow," he said. "I was going to say 7 days. We file tomorrow." Nobody argued. "The injunction is straightforward. We have enough documentation to freeze the tax collection while the discrepancy is investigated. That's the defensive move." Cross looked around the room. "The complaint to the territorial court is the offensive one. We are alleging a systematic pattern of document fraud in the county records office coordinated with a scheme to coerce property owners through manipulated debt instruments." He paused. "If the territorial court accepts the complaint, and I believe they will with what we have here, they will appoint an independent investigator. Hayes cannot touch an independent territorial investigator. That's outside his reach," Corr said from his chair in the corner. "Will I get my land back?" The room went quiet. Cross looked at him. "I can't promise that," he said with the honest directness of a man who respects his listener too much to lie. "What was done to you may not be fully reversible. But if we can prove the fraud, then every transaction that followed from it is legally questionable. A good attorney with this evidence could make a compelling case." He paused. "It's more than you had yesterday." Corr nodded. "It's more than I had yesterday," he agreed. "That's enough for now." Eleanor looked at this man who had lost 400 acres and 2,000 head of cattle, and was now working as a laborer in Butte, who had gotten on a train and come here with his documents, because a woman he'd never met asked him to. And she thought about what it must have cost him to do that. To come back to the valley, where he'd been destroyed, and sit in a room and help build a case that might not give him back what he'd lost. She thought this is what courage actually looks like. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet, practical kind, the kind that shows up anyway. "Mr. Corr," she said. "Thank you." He looked at her. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just make sure it counts." They filed the next morning. Cross went to the county courthouse personally with Thomas beside him, and Eleanor waited at the ranch because Cross said having her present would give Hayes's people the opportunity to create a public confrontation designed to disrupt the filing. She waited at the ranch with Pete and Corr, who was staying in the spare room that had been Eleanor's until she moved to the larger one off the kitchen, and she sat at the kitchen table and worked through the additional documentation she'd been preparing. A comparative analysis of all 7 ranches, organized by date and method, showing the pattern of what had been done to each one, because she needed her hands to be doing something, or she would drive herself out of her mind. Pete made coffee. Corr sat at the table across from Eleanor and watched her work. "You were supposed to marry a farmer," he said after a while. "I was," Eleanor said. And instead you ended up here." "I did." Cor was quiet for a moment. "My wife said that things happen the way they need to happen," he said. "I never entirely believe that. Too convenient." He paused. "But sometimes it seems like maybe things happen the way they need to for someone else, even if not for you." He looked at the papers Eleanor was organizing. "Gerald Hatch wrote a letter, and you got on a train, and now you're here building the thing that might bring Hayes down." He paused. "I don't think Gerald Hatch knew what he was doing when he wrote that letter. He was trying to find a capable woman," Eleanor said. "He found one," Cor said. Thomas and Cross came back at midday. Thomas came through the door first, and Eleanor knew from his face before he said a word that it had gone through. "Filed," she said. "Filed," Thomas said. "Both documents. The clerk tried to tell us we needed additional forms for the territorial complaint, and Cross recited statute at him for 4 minutes until the clerk decided the forms were fine." Cross came in behind Thomas, brushing dust from his coat. "Leonard Pratt was in the courthouse," he said. "He saw us. He knows." "How long before Hayes knows?" Eleanor asked. "An hour," Cross said. "Maybe less." "Then we have about an hour before everything changes," Eleanor said. "What do we do with an hour?" Pete asked. "We eat," Eleanor said. "And then we get ready." She made food because making food was something concrete and useful, and her hands needed something concrete and useful, and they sat at the table, Thomas and Cross and Cor and Pete and Eleanor, and they ate together, and nobody talked much, and the meal was simple and good, and the kitchen was warm, and Eleanor thought that this was the kind of moment you didn't know you'd remember until later when you were looking back at it. The hour passed, and then the rider came. He came hard up the ranch road, which told Eleanor before he even reached the gate that it wasn't a casual message. Thomas went to the door, and Eleanor was right behind him. And the rider was one of the young men from the stable in town, red-faced from the pace his horse blowing hard. "Message from Judge Cross's wife," the rider said. "She said to come quick. Said someone's been to the house. Said they took something." Cross was already moving before the sentence was finished. They rode into town together, Cross and Thomas and Eleanor and Cross's wife, a small composed woman named Helen, who had the focused calm of someone who is frightened and refusing to show it, met them at the door. "2 men came," Helen said. 40 minutes ago. I told them Avery wasn't here. They said they had business. When I told them to come back later, one of them went to the study window." She paused. "They didn't come inside, but when I went to the study afterward..." She looked at her husband. "The file on the left side of your desk. The correspondence file." Cross went to the study. He came back out with an expression that Eleanor had not seen on him before. Flat. Cold. "The copies of the county letters," he said. "The ones that showed the altered language. They're gone." The hallway was very quiet. "They went through the window," Thomas said. "Yes." While she was at the door talking to the other one. "Yes." Eleanor thought. She thought fast, and she thought clearly, and she said, "Cross, did you keep copies of those letters anywhere else?" "In my files at the courthouse," Cross said. "In the territorial records I submitted this morning." He paused. "Hayes can't touch those. The originals are now part of a formal territorial filing. The copies from my house are gone, but they're not the originals." He looked at Eleanor. "He made his move too late." "He made it to rattle us," Eleanor said. "He knows he can't get the filings back. This was to make us feel like we're losing ground." She looked at Thomas. "It means we're scaring him." Thomas looked at her. "We are scaring him," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Good." But the next morning brought something worse than rattled nerves. The next morning, Gerald Hatch came to the ranch riding too fast and with the specific look of a man who has not slept and has run out of time to pretend otherwise. Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window and was out the door before he had fully stopped his horse. "What happened?" she said. Gerald climbed down. His hands were shaking. "Hayes came to the farm last night," Gerald said. "Late. He came himself, not his men. Hayes himself, which Clara said she'd never seen him do before. He came, and he sat at our table, and he was very calm and very quiet. And he told me that he knew we had spoken to Cross, and that he knew I had given you the copy of the loan document. Gerald stopped, swallowed. He told me that if I provided a sworn statement in support of the territorial complaint, he would call the loan due immediately, and he would do it through Harlan Creek Land Holdings, so that by the time any legal remedy could be found, the farm would be gone. He looked at Eleanor, and the shame in his face was enormous. He was telling me that if I speak, I lose everything anyway. He was telling me there's no point. Thomas came out of the barn behind Eleanor. "Gerald," he said. Gerald looked at him. There was in that look a long history of small-town proximity. Two men who had been neighbors in a valley for years, who had traded nods at church socials and brief words at the feed store, who had never been close but had existed in each other's periphery, as decent neighbors do. And something in Gerald's face cracked slightly at being looked at with steadiness instead of judgment. "What do I do?" Gerald said. It was the most honest thing Eleanor had heard him say. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Gerald. "Where is Clara?" she said. "At the farm. She wanted to come. I told her to wait until I—" He stopped. "I told her to wait." "Go get her," Eleanor said. "Both of you come back here. Bring the copy of the loan document and anything else from that tin box that touches Hayes." She paused. "And Gerald." He looked at her. "He called that loan the moment he decided you were a threat," Eleanor said. "Whether you speak or stay silent, the loan is called. You understood that when you gave me that document. He's telling you silence will protect you, but silence has never protected anyone from Hayes." She held his gaze. "He's bluffing. Not about calling the loan he'll do that, but about what happens after. Because if this complaint goes forward, and Hayes has investigated, every instrument he holds against every person in this valley gets scrutinized, including yours." She paused. "The only way through is through." Gerald looked at her for a long time. "You're not frightened of him," he said. "Not an accusation. Something like wonder." "I'm frightened of him," Eleanor said. "I'm also furious, and I find that the fury is stronger." She paused. "Go get Clara." He went. Thomas came to stand beside her as Gerald rode out. "Cross needs to know about last night's visit," Thomas said. "Hayes going to the farm personally making direct threats, that's evidence of consciousness of guilt. It goes into the record." "I know," Eleanor said. "Write it down while it's fresh. Every detail Gerald told us. Time what was said that it was Hayes himself." She paused. "Is Pete back from Ellery?" "Got in before dawn," Thomas said. "Ellery signed a sworn statement. Pete has it." Eleanor looked at the road where Gerald had disappeared. "We're going to be all right," she said. She said it the way you say something when you are deciding to believe it rather than because you already do. Thomas said quietly, "I know." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that behind-the-eyes look. But this time, he didn't look away when she caught it, and neither did she. And the moment held, the way moments hold when two people have been through enough together that they are no longer quite strangers to each other's interiors. "Eleanor," he said. "Not yet," she said, gently, steadily. "Let's finish this first." He nodded. He understood. Gerald came back with Clara an hour later, and they sat at the table, and Eleanor listened and organized, and Thomas held the room, and Pete made coffee, and Cross, who had been sent for, arrived by mid-morning, and Gerald told him everything Hayes had said the night before, and Cross wrote it all down, and when Gerald had finished, Cross looked up from his notes. "He threatened a witness in an active territorial complaint," Cross said. "That is no longer a civil matter. That is criminal conduct." He set his pen down. "I need to send a wire to Helena today." He went to send it. And in the kitchen of the Carter Ranch, Eleanor sat across from Gerald and Clara Hatch, the man who had once been a letter and a hope, and then a humiliation, and then a piece of evidence, and then improbably something like an ally, and she thought about how strange and circuitous a path could be. How something could begin as your worst moment, and become the foundation of something you could not have planned. Gerald looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. "For all of it. I know that doesn't fix—" "No," Eleanor said. "It doesn't. But it's not nothing either." She paused. "Use it to do the right thing. That's all anyone can do with an apology." The wire to Helena went out at noon. By evening there was a reply. An independent territorial investigator would arrive in Harlan Creek in 4 days. William Hayes read the telegram his man brought him at 7 that evening, and for the first time in 2 decades of methodical acquisition, he understood that he had made a mistake. Not in what he'd done, in who he'd underestimated. He sat with that for a long time, and in the Carter Ranch kitchen, Eleanor washed the supper dishes and listened to the sound of voices in the next room. Thomas and Cor and Pete talking the particular warm sound of people who have been through something hard together. And she dried her hands on the cloth by the sink and looked out the dark window at her own reflection. She thought, like someone who lived here. The investigator's name was Robert Crane, and he arrived on the Thursday morning train looking like exactly what he was, a man sent by people with authority to find out what people with less authority had done wrong. He was 50 compact with a gray suit that had seen serious use, and the particular unhurried manner of someone who has been lied to professionally for long enough that he no longer reacts to lies the way ordinary people do. He simply noted them, set them aside, and continued. Cross met him at the station. Eleanor was not there because Cross had suggested she stay away from the initial arrival, and she had agreed not because she was afraid of Crane, but because she understood optics. A woman who appeared too eager to get in front of the investigator looked like a woman with a performance prepared. What she had was not a performance. She would wait to be asked. She was asked by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Crane came to the ranch with Cross and Thomas, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He didn't drink, and a leather notebook. He wrote in, with economical, precise strokes, and he looked at Eleanor the way she imagined he looked at everything, without preconception, without particular warmth, but with complete attention. "Tell me," he said from the beginning, "not what you think I need to know. Everything." Eleanor told him everything. She had organized it in her mind the night before, in the particular way she organized large things by sequence, by source, by what could be documented and what could only be attested. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping except when Crane asked a clarifying question, and she watched him write, and she did not editorialize or embroider or reach for sympathy. She gave him facts in the order they had occurred, and she identified the gaps where she had inference rather than evidence, and she told him what each piece of documentation showed and where it came from. When she finished, Crane looked at his notebook for a moment. "You have a considerable mind for organization," he said. "I've been told it's wasted," Eleanor said. Crane looked at her. "By whom?" "Various people over the years." He wrote something in his notebook. "How long were you managing household accounts before this?" "In a professional capacity, 3 years. Before that, informally from about age 9. "Did you find any discrepancies in the Carter accounts that predated Hayes's involvement?" "None." "And the tax assessment records you identified the handwriting discrepancy yourself?" "Yes." "Without legal or forensic training?" "Without formal training," Eleanor said. "I've been looking at account books long enough that inconsistency in handwriting and ink pressure stands out to me the same way an incorrect sum would," Crane wrote again. He had a way of writing that suggested he was capturing not just what was said, but what was behind it, the texture of the speaker, and Eleanor found she didn't mind being captured that way. She had been looked at her whole life by people who saw only the surface. Being documented by someone interested in what was underneath. Was she realized an unfamiliar and quietly extraordinary thing? "Mr. Hayes's letter alleging financial disputes in St. Louis," Crane said. "I'll need you to respond to that directly." "There are no financial disputes in St. Louis," Eleanor said. "I worked at a laundry for 3 years, and before that at a household as a domestic account manager for 2. I left both positions in good standing with written references that I have with me. I have never had a financial dispute with any person or institution. I have never had a debt I did not pay." She paused. "If Hayes has documents suggesting otherwise, those documents were manufactured. I would welcome the opportunity to examine them and tell you exactly why." "That won't be necessary," Crane said. "I already sent a wire to St. Louis before I arrived. His characterization does not correspond to anything in any record I could locate." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. Hayes had put that allegation in the letter, knowing it was a lie, betting that no one would move fast enough to check. "He was counting on the accusation being enough," Eleanor said, "without anyone examining it." "That appears to be correct," Crane said. He closed his notebook, which Eleanor understood meant that portion was finished. "I'll need to speak with the Hatch family tomorrow," Crane said, "and I'll be visiting the county records office this afternoon." He paused. "I want you to understand, Miss Whitmore, that the pace of a territorial investigation is not always as fast as the circumstances seem to demand. I cannot promise you a resolution in days." "I understand that," Eleanor said. "The injunction cross-filed freezes the tax collection for a minimum of 60 days while the investigation proceeds. The immediate threat to Mr. Carter's property is suspended." He looked at her. "You have some time." "Thank you," Eleanor said. Crane stood picking up his hat. At the door, he paused. "One more question," he said. "Yes." "What do you intend to do," he said, "after, whatever the outcome?" Eleanor looked at him. It was the first question she hadn't been prepared for, and she recognized that he had saved it for last, deliberately, because an unprepared answer was more honest than a prepared one. "I intend to stay," she said. It was the first time she had said it out loud directly without qualification. Crane nodded once, as though this was the expected answer, and left. Thomas, who had been standing in the doorway through the last exchange, came into the kitchen when Crane's horse moved off down the road. He didn't say anything for a moment. He stood at the counter with his back to her, and Eleanor waited because she had learned that Thomas needed a moment to arrive at things that mattered. He turned around. "You intend to stay?" he said. "Yes." "On this ranch?" "Not necessarily on this ranch," Eleanor said carefully. "In this valley. In Harlan Creek." She paused. "I told you I had nowhere to go back to. But it's more than that now. I have something here, something I built. I don't leave things I've built." Thomas looked at her for a long time. "Eleanor," he said. "Thomas, I am not good at this," he said, "at saying the particular things that need saying. I'm aware that there have been moments where a different man would have spoken sooner, more clearly." He stopped, started again. "I have spent 4 years convincing myself that the life I had before was the only kind of life I was going to get. That Margaret and the boy, that losing them meant I had used up whatever I was allowed to have." He paused. "I know that's not a reasonable thing to believe. I believed it anyway." Eleanor said nothing. She let him find his way to the end of it. "You came here broken," Thomas said. "Or you were supposed to be broken. And instead, you sat at my kitchen table and reorganized my accounts and found the problem in my ranch operation and wrote letters to suppliers and put the ledger book back in the study where it belonged and made me eat regular meals and told Constance Alderman to mind her business in language that was so perfectly polite it took her 3 days to realize she'd been dismissed." He paused. "And somewhere in the middle of all that, I stopped thinking about what I'd lost and started thinking about what was in front of me." Eleanor's hands were very still in her lap. "You are the most competent, most stubborn, most clear-eyed person I have encountered in 36 years, Thomas said. "And I—" He stopped. "I don't want you to stay in this valley. I want you to stay here, in this house, with me." He looked at her directly. "If that is something you could want." Eleanor thought about the platform in the dark. She thought about the torn letter and the 840 miles and the station clerk with his crooked spectacles. She thought about the night she had whispered to nobody that maybe people like her were never meant to be chosen. She thought about being wrong. "Yes," she said, "that is something I could want. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in his face had released something that had been held very tight for a very long time, and the releasing of it made him look younger and more himself, as though the man he had been before 4 years of grief was still there underneath, and had just been given permission to come forward. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took both her hands in his, and they were warm and certain. Those working hands, and Eleanor held them back with the same certainty, and they stood like that in the kitchen of the ranch that was being saved, and the life that was being remade, and neither of them said another word, because nothing else needed to be said right now. There would be time for words. There was suddenly a great deal of time. Crane's investigation moved faster than anyone had expected, because Crane himself was a man who operated with focused efficiency, and because the evidence Eleanor had assembled was, as he told Cross privately, the most organized documentation of its kind he had encountered in 12 years of territorial work. He did not say this to flatter anyone. He said it because it was operationally relevant. Organized evidence meant faster review. Faster review meant faster findings. Faster findings meant Hayes had less time to maneuver. Leonard Pratt, the county records clerk, broke on the second day. He had held out through Crane's first interview with the fixed, slightly desperate expression of a man who has decided his story and is going to tell it no matter what. Then Crane laid Gerald's copy of the loan document on the table between them, and the copy of the altered tax assessment, with the handwriting comparison Eleanor had annotated, and the sworn statements from Core and Ellery, and finally a single bank record that Crane had obtained through the territorial court, showing a deposit to Pratt's personal account 3 weeks before each of the 7 ranches changed hands. 7 deposits, 7 ranches. Pratt looked at the bank records for a long time. Then he said, "I want to speak to a lawyer." Crane said, "That is your right." Pratt said, "Before I do that, I want you to know that I have records. Hayes told me to destroy them. I didn't." He looked at his hands. "I don't know why I didn't. I couldn't." Crane's pen was already moving. When Thomas told Eleanor about Pratt that evening, she sat very still for a moment. "He kept them," she said. "He kept them," Thomas confirmed. "Crane wouldn't tell me what's in them, but he said they were," he used the word, "comprehensive." Eleanor pressed her hand briefly over her mouth, a gesture she almost never made, and then lowered it. "That poor, foolish man," she said, and she meant it genuinely without irony. Pratt, who had been bought and used and had held onto his guilt in paper form because he couldn't bear to be entirely without evidence of his own conscience. "Don't feel too sorry for him," Pete said from the doorway. "I don't feel sorry for him," Eleanor said. "I feel sorry for what he let himself become. That's different." Pete considered this, and then nodded in the manner of a man acknowledging a distinction he hadn't considered and finds valid. The investigator's report took 11 days. In those 11 days, Eleanor did not stop working. She finalized the supplier arrangements she'd been negotiating for Thomas and drafted the letters that would formalize them. She completed the comparative analysis of all 7 ranch losses, the document she'd been building for weeks, and Cross sent a copy to the territorial attorney's office because he said it was the clearest narrative account of the overall scheme he had yet seen. She met twice more with Clara Hatch, who was building towards something Eleanor recognized as courage. Finding its full form, the courage that comes not from never being afraid, but from deciding that the fear is not the point. She also, on a Thursday afternoon when the work was quiet for an hour, sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and wrote a letter to her aunt in Cincinnati. She told her aunt where she was and what had happened and what she had done. She did not ask for approval, and she did not apologize for the decisions that had led her here. She described the valley and the ranch and the man who had offered her a spare room with a lock on the door and a meal warming on the stove, and she said at the end of the letter simply, "I believe I am exactly where I am supposed to be, and I think you will understand that I could not have said that truthfully in a very long time." She sealed it and gave it to Pete to take to the post office, and Pete took it without comment, but he came back that afternoon with a small package of peppermints that he set on the kitchen table without explanation, which Eleanor understood was Pete's way of saying something warm that he would never say out loud. and she ate one peppermint and left the rest on the table, where anyone could reach them, and Pete took 3 over the course of the evening, without acknowledging that he had. Crane's report arrived on a Friday. Hayes was formally charged with fraud, coercion, and conspiracy to defraud property owners through the deliberate alteration of public records. Leonard Pratt was charged as an accessory. Foster Dobbs, Clara's uncle, was named as a co-conspirator pending further investigation. The Territorial Attorney's Office was taking the case. 3 things happened in the 24 hours that followed. First, Hayes's lawyer filed a motion to challenge the investigation on procedural grounds, which Crane had apparently anticipated, because his report had been structured specifically to withstand exactly that challenge, and the motion was denied within 6 hours. Second, the injunction on Thomas's tax assessment was made permanent, pending resolution of the fraud case, which meant the manufactured debt was frozen and unenforceable. Third, Hayes left town. He didn't announce it. He simply wasn't there one morning, his house locked, his horses gone, his man Briggs nowhere to be found. The Territorial Court issued a warrant, and it would catch up with him eventually. Cross said, because the territorial network was comprehensive, and Hayes was not the kind of man who could disappear into rough country and survive there. He was a city man dressed in land-baron clothing, and without his lawyers and his records clerks and his strategic levers, he was considerably smaller than he had appeared. When Thomas told Eleanor that Hayes was gone, she was at the kitchen table with her coffee. She sat with it for a moment. "Good," she said. Thomas looked at her. "That's all? What else would you like me to say?" "I don't know," Thomas said. "I thought you might feel relieved," Eleanor said. "I feel relieved. And I feel the particular satisfaction of having done something that mattered with people who were worth doing it with." She looked at her coffee. "I don't feel triumphant. I feel like I can breathe correctly for the first time in 11 weeks. Thomas sat down across from her. "What do you need?" he said. "Right now. What do you actually need?" Eleanor thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I need to sleep past 5 o'clock one morning," she said. "I need Pete to stop pretending he doesn't eat the peppermints. And I need—" She stopped. "What?" "I need this to keep feeling real," she said. "It still feels slightly like something I'm going to wake up from." Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "It's real," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "I know," she said. "I know it is." 2 weeks later, on a Saturday that arrived bright and cold and impossibly clear, the way Montana Saturdays could, in late autumn, Daniel Corr received a letter from the Territorial Attorney's Office. It said that given the evidence of fraudulent conduct in the county records, the property transfers related to the Harlan Creek landholding scheme were being reviewed, and that 3 of the 7 affected ranches, including Corr's, had been identified as candidates for restoration proceedings. It was not a guarantee. It was not a promise. But it was the first official communication that used the word restoration in connection with land that had been taken from him. And when Corr read it at the kitchen table of the Carter Ranch, where he had been staying through the investigation, his hands shook slightly and he set the letter down and looked out the window for a long time. Nobody said anything. Pete refilled his coffee. That was enough. Corr left for Butte that afternoon to speak with the Territorial Attorney's representative directly. Before he left, he shook Thomas's hand and then looked at Eleanor, and whatever he wanted to say was too large for the moment he had available, so he simply said, "You told me to come. I'm glad I came." Eleanor said, "So am I." "Mr. Corr, so am I." He tipped his hat and rode to the station, and Eleanor watched him go, and she thought about what Cross had said more than you had yesterday, and she thought that this was what justice actually looked like. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind with speeches and ceremonies, the kind that arrived as a letter on a Saturday morning and made a man's hands shake, and that was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. In November, Eleanor opened an office. It was a small room above the dry goods store, which Margaret Sully's husband Robert offered her at a modest rent, with the particular combination of practical decency and mild guilt that characterized his better moments. She put a sign on the door that said, "Eleanor Whitmore Property and Accounts," and she spent 2 days making the room functional with the same systematic efficiency she had brought to Thomas's study. And on the 3rd day, she opened the door and sat at her desk and waited. She did not wait long. The first person through the door was a woman named Ada Ferris, whose husband had died in September and left behind a farm with accounts that had not been kept in 3 years, and a loan from a bank in Billings that Ada did not understand and was frightened to ask about. Eleanor spent 2 hours with Ada, and at the end of those 2 hours, Ada understood her loan, her accounts, and her options, and she left with the particular expression of a woman who came in carrying something she couldn't see and is leaving having put it down. At the door, Ada turned back. "How much do I owe you?" she said. "Nothing this time," Eleanor said. "Come back when you need help again. We'll keep an account." Ada looked at her. "People are saying things about you," she said. "People say you caused trouble." "I solved trouble," Eleanor said. "The distinction matters." Ada nodded. "Yes," she said. "It does." And she left. By the end of the first month, Eleanor had 6 regular clients. By the end of the second, she had 12, and 2 of them were men ranchers, who had initially been uncertain and had arrived at her door with the slightly defensive air of people doing something they weren't sure about, and had left with their accounts organized and the defensive air gone, and something more practical in its place. Margaret Sully started sending her coffee in the mornings, without being asked. Constance Alderman walked past the office window one afternoon and gave Eleanor the infinitesimal nod of a woman revising a position she would never formally acknowledge having held. Eleanor accepted the nod with equal tact. Pete said one evening at the ranch, "The whole valley knows your name now." "I know," Eleanor said. "Half of them are glad about it." "What about the other half?" "Getting there," Pete said. And he ate a peppermint. The formal hearing on the Hayes case was scheduled for February in Helena, and Cross was preparing to attend as a primary witness. Gerald and Clara Hatch had both given formal depositions, and Gerald had done so with the particular purposefulness of a man who has finally found the right use for his guilt. Eleanor had reviewed the depositions and found them solid and consistent and true, and she had told Gerald so, and the relief on his face was the relief of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long he has forgotten what it would feel like to set it down. "You know I still owe you an apology," Gerald said. "A real one, not a legal statement." "You owe Clara an apology," Eleanor said. "And from what I've seen, you're working on it." She paused. "As for me, you wrote a letter that brought me here. Everything that followed from that, I'll accept as the terms." Gerald looked at her. "That's extraordinarily generous." "It's not generosity," Eleanor said. "It's accurate accounting." She paused. "I'm very good at accurate accounting." He almost laughed. It was the closest thing to an unguarded moment she had seen from him, and she thought there is a decent man in there who has made poor choices and is trying to make better ones. That was, she had learned about as much as you could ask of any person. December came into the valley cold and clear, and the ranch was different than it had been in October. The south pasture rotation was in its second phase, and Pete reported the results were better than projected. The new supplier arrangement had reduced feed costs by more than the estimate. The ledger books were current annotated and kept in the study on the shelf where they belonged. The lamp chimney was intact. The draft under the back door was sealed. The house was warm. Not just in the way that houses with good stoves are warm. In the way that houses with people in them are warm when the people inside them are not merely coexisting, but are genuinely actively alive in each other's company. Thomas had started talking more. Eleanor had noticed it gradually, then all at once the way you notice a season changing. One morning you look up and the thing is already different and you can't point to the exact moment it shifted. He talked about the ranch, about the cattle, about what he wanted to build in the spring. He talked about Margaret sometimes briefly honestly, without the careful pain of a man who has only recently permitted himself to say the name. And Eleanor listened and asked questions, and did not treat the subject as something fragile, because Thomas, she had determined, needed someone who could hold the weight of his past alongside him without flinching. He started finishing her sentences occasionally. She started finishing his. Pete observed this with the stoic satisfaction of a man who has kept a secret he never told, because it wasn't his secret to tell. On a Sunday, in mid-December, they rode out to the north pasture together to check the fence line, which was something Thomas usually did with Pete, and had taken to doing with Eleanor instead on Sunday mornings when the week's work had settled. The creek ran below them, and the mountains were very white and very present on the horizon, and Eleanor was thinking about the February hearing and the restoration proceedings for Core's property, and whether Ada Ferris understood the renewal clause in her Billings loan. She was almost always thinking about several things at once when Thomas pulled his horse to a stop. She pulled hers alongside. "I want to ask you something," Thomas said. Eleanor waited. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not I said something in the kitchen in November that was true and meant, but it was not I said it in the wrong order. I asked whether you could want something before I told you clearly what I was asking for." Eleanor looked at him. "Eleanor Whitmore," Thomas said. And he said her full name, the way he had said it on the platform all those weeks ago, the first time when he was a stranger with his hat in his hands, and she was a woman with a torn letter in her lap, and neither of them had any idea what they were building. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because I need help running the ranch, though you have made the ranch considerably more functional than it was. Not because I'm lonely, though I was. Because you are—" He stopped. "Because I want to spend the rest of my life being the person you think is worth looking at the way you look at me." The creek ran below them. The mountains held their ground. Eleanor looked at this man, this weathered, careful, working-handed, quietly tremendous man who had looked at her on a dark platform and seen a person rather than a problem, and had never, not once in all the weeks since, looked at her any other way. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Thomas Carter." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, and she gave it, and they stayed there like that for a moment on the north pasture of the ranch that was saved above the creek, that had been worth fighting for beneath the mountains, that did not know or care about any of it, and were magnificent anyway. Then Thomas said, "Pete is going to say he knew from the first week." "Pete did know from the first week," Eleanor said. "He's going to be insufferable about it." "He's earned it," Eleanor said. "Let him be insufferable." Thomas squeezed her hand once and let it go, and they turned their horses back toward the ranch, and Eleanor felt something settle in her, some long-held uncertainty, some waiting. She hadn't known she was doing, settle and become still the way water settles, after something large has moved through it and the surface finds its level again. She thought about the platform. She thought about the torn letter, and the cold, and the station clerk, and the long, terrible stillness of sitting alone in the dark, believing nobody was coming. She thought about a man's voice, quiet, deliberate, careful not to startle, saying, "Don't sit alone, miss," and how she had looked up and found someone who was looking back at her like she mattered, and how that had been the beginning of everything. She had arrived believing she was not the kind of woman who got chosen. She had learned over 11 weeks and 840 miles and a land fraud case and a county record scandal and more account books than she could count that this was the wrong question, the wrong thing to wait for. Being chosen was what happened when someone else made a decision about your worth, and other people's decisions about your worth had never once in 25 years accurately reflected what you actually were. The right question was not, will someone choose me? The right question was, what am I going to build? And she had built something. She had built an office with a sign on the door. She had built a fair shot for 7 families who had been systematically robbed. She had built a friendship with Pete that expressed itself entirely in coffee and peppermints and gruff, accurate observations. She had built something with Clara Hatch that had started as strategy and was becoming quietly and genuinely something that looked like friendship. She had built a home out of a house that grief had emptied, and she had done it not by filling the space with herself, but by working alongside the man who lived in it until the warmth came back. Naturally, the way warmth always does when people stop shutting it out, and she had built without entirely planning to a life. Not the life she had traveled 840 miles to find. Better. The ranch gate came into view, and Pete was in the yard, and he looked up when they rode in and looked at their faces and looked at their hands and said with complete composure, "Took you long enough." Thomas said, "You knew from the first week." "I knew from the first day," Pete said. "She fixed the lamp chimney." He picked up his tools. "I'll start on the fence repair in the south field." He walked away. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Thomas. And the life they were going to build together was already quietly underway. Not because the world had finally decided to give Eleanor Whitmore what she deserved, but because Eleanor Whitmore had decided on a cold platform in the dark with a torn letter in her hands that she was not going to sit still and wait for the world to make up its mind about her. She had stood up, she had gotten in the wagon, and she had built the rest herself.